welcome to Media and Musings. Specifically, hello to Godless Scummer, and of course to anyone who is lurking in the chat and or watching in the future.
Hello.
So this was originally going to be a reception of classical warfare episode, but then we actually started reading 300, the graphic novel, to prepare for it, and
honestly, there's nothing that can be said about Troy 2004 that cannot be included in this discussion. And we've got a lot to say about 300, both the novel, I suppose, and the graphic novel and the film, which we've seen now. A couple of things I want to just, again, make very clear, because we did the primer on classical reception.
Yes.
And we talked about accuracy versus authenticity. And I hammered that point home so hard, I think I gave it a concussion.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things wrong with 300 the movie and 300 the graphic novel from a purely academic, this is what Herodotus says happened there at that time. We're going to skip over all of that. One, because it's not relevant, unless it is relevant, in which case we'll nod to it, but we're not going to get hung up on it. And two, because this is a graphic novel and a movie, folks, if you want historical accuracy, the link to the Herodotus in translation is in the description. Go read that. Although, again, Herodotus is not exactly known for being historically accurate anyway. Like, the man, father of history, all that jazz, but very uncritical in how he received histories. Like, very clearly states in his own writings that he writes everything that he's told down, even if he doesn't necessarily believe it himself. So, as with anything that we're not entirely sure of the provenance of, that is quite obviously not something someone actually witnessed firsthand, and even if they did, there are issues of memory and oral tradition, etc. Take it with a pinch of salt. You know, like, Carthage has got plenty to spare and it's just up the coastline. It's not, but, you know, just take it with a pinch of salt, okay? We're receiving Herodotus through several thousand years of, I don't want to say history, but of people using this story for their own ends.
Of propagandistic telephone.
Yes. We're playing telephone and there's a propagandist on the other end. So don't take the film or the book as a definite, this is what happened, because it's not. But do be aware of the fact that a lot of the stuff within the graphic novel especially, and also within the film, like, give Snyder his due, some of the stuff within the film, while not accurate to Spartan society, Spartan history, Spartan anything, very much is authentic to the feel of what Sparta may have been like, of how Spartans may have behaved, of the Spartan mindset and mentality.
Yeah.
And that's more interesting to talk about, especially when we look at, and also let's say very clearly, because I always tell you, if you're watching something about Sparta and you don't hear within the first 10 minutes what I'm about to say, you should either be watching incredibly critically or turning it off. Sparta was a fascist society. For some people who will talk about Sparta, that's a feature and not a bug. I have my own opinions, and I think, frankly, Snyder, it falls more on the feature than bug. Miller, a little bit more bug than feature. And that tension between the two creators is something we are going to discuss.
And I actually have a bit of a disagreement with that statement.
as do I, which I'm sure we'll get into. But
Yeah.
the Spartans were, make no bones about it, a fascist society. There's a reason the Hitler Youth started the way it did and was set up the way it did, and it drew. And, there's a reason a lot of the aesthetics of Sparta appear in fascist states. It's not an accident. It's not if you're anti-fascist, it's a bug, not a feature. To the Spartans themselves, arguably, it is a feature. Like, the point of the Spartan political setup was fascism.
Yeah.
And I have an entire conversation that we will be having about the complete absence of helots in both the novel and the movie. Because while that is not accurate, it's not authentic either, and it's something that should really... I can see why they did it, but it is something worth discussing, especially in the context of this book and this movie, which have serious issues with race and ableism and other issues. So blanket trigger warning also for everything we're going to discuss on this stream. It's got every kind of bigotry imaginable and then piles more on top, usually in the form of the bodies of the people that it's dehumanizing. So that's my sort of broad introduction. We're looking at authenticity, not accuracy, except where accuracy is relevant to the discussion of authenticity, which we will flag to you. I took a lot of notes on this comic. You know me, I'm not a big comic reader. On my tablet, 14 pages of notes.
Yeah. Noodle's not a big comic reader. I am working on fixing that.
Yes.
As Noodle is working on fixing me not being an opera watcher.
Tit for tat.
Yeah.
For every comic I read, you've got to see an opera. It takes about the same length of time, to be fair. So I think our best bet is to talk about the comic. And peppering discussions of the film as we go through where relevant. Because if we start ranting and raving about the film, we won't talk about anything else. Because I have opinions. And I know you do too.
And we're probably going to gloss over a bit on the This is Sparta scene.
Yes, because you have enough opinions on there for a video all of its own, which will be coming up, I'm sure. So you have 300 and it opens with this scene of just honor plastered across the page. And there's a thing you have to understand about this text is this text codified the Spartan aesthetic in the modern public consciousness. Like, if you talk to any Tom, Dick, or Harry out on the street and you say Sparta, what they think of is this graphic novel, this movie. 9 times out of 10. Very much in the same way Gladiator codified ancient Greece to a modern cinema audience. So when we talk about the impact of this novel, we are not understating that.
So arguably, it'd probably be fair to say that the graphic novel only became more culturally ubiquitous after the film was released.
Yes. And the film,
can talk, I swear.
And the film broke box office records. Like, the film was released in March and broke the record for March releases at the time. Like, the record forever. So this was not, this was not a little thing that's off to the side that we can ignore. This shaped the mindset of a generation. And you have to also go with the movie, especially came out in 2006.
Yeah.
We're already in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is very relevant, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. We are, what would you say about in 2006? About, I mean, 7/7's already. So we're about waist to chest deep in the global war on terror.
Yeah.
Like, we're not quite drowning in it yet, but we're stuck. Like, it's quicksand. If you want to take that analogy. And most media about ancient Greece, even just about warfare in general, that follows this movie makes allusions to it as a shorthand for what it represented. Like, you talk about Sparta and the 300, you immediately know that there are certain words that pop into your head. And I actually, I sat there and just as a little sort of game with myself, I created a mind map of what comes to mind when you think of Sparta. And I just did that off the top of my head, wasn't thinking about it, didn't Google anything, just what pops into your head. And I think that's a discussion worth having on stream. So if you're in the comments, if you're in the chat, there's no wrong answers. Just, if I say the word Sparta to you, what pops into your head? Yeah. And we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that while maybe Ring gives an answer to that.
Okay, hold on, because first I want to... So, because we were talking about the cultural impact,
yes,
of 300, and I wanted to share a little thing that was actually included in the thumbnail.
Yes.
Yeah.
Zoom in a bit on that because it's a little bit.
Yeah, let's see. I'm gonna. Oh, that works. Good. So, for those of you who aren't aware, this is from a webcomic called Terminal Lance. It's done by I don't know if the artist is still in the Marines, but it's done by someone who served in the Marines as a lance corporal, the equivalent of a specialist.
Is a specialist the equivalent of a lance corporal, or is a lance corporal the equivalent of a specialist? Discuss.
Depends on your point of view.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, so, and we will get into this discussion about them being gay pederasts because neither of those words are correct.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that second word means, but don't ask, don't tell. So Sparta, hoorah, basically. Yeah. This is the kind of attitude I really want to combat with this stream.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of attitude that really is causes more problems than it solves, frankly.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair comment to make. And it does, but it's interesting because it's indicative of the mentality. Yeah. And the thing is, when we're talking about the reception of it, it's so important to understand that context. That's why I immediately opened this stream with, in 2006, we were already in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were knee-deep in the war on terror, because those things matter. Do you think this movie would have been such a box office smash hit, would have had such a cultural impact if America and Afghanistan hadn't been at war and, hadn't been at war?
And then, and in 98, when, 300 graphic novel was published in 98, which was 3 years after the U.S. started sanctioning Iran.
Yeah. So it's post-Iran sanctions, but it's also it's post-Desert Storm as well.
Yeah.
Which I think is an important point to make. Because if you understand anything about American history, I appreciate that I'm preaching to a former specialist of the US Army as I say this.
Yeah.
America suffered from something, it's generally accepted, suffered from something known as Vietnam syndrome.
Yeah.
And how that presented in media was that after the end of the Vietnam War, which America did lose, just to make that statement,
Yeah.
America proceeded to refight that war across all media forms in many different ways in order to try and reckon with the fact that it had lost a major military campaign. And America never became comfortable with the loss of Vietnam.
Yeah.
And the Vietnam War and what that represented to America as a country.
A fun little anecdote. While I was working as an intel analyst in Afghanistan, we weren't allowed to use the word offensive because it reminded the officers of the Tet.
Exactly. So this is it's a shadow cast, and there was some attempt after Desert Storm. That was America's, oh yes, we're back on top, we won, we've beaten them because, you know, this is, Vietnam's now by the wayside. The problem was, Desert Storm and Vietnam were two very different military engagements.
Yes, offensive was very offensive to the snowflakes I was surfing under.
Yes. But, and so when America then went into Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw a resurgence of Vietnam syndrome. And we saw, again, media. I'm sure we all remember Men Who Stare at Goats coming out. I'm sure we all remember that uptick in films about ancient Rome, but also films about warfare, films about Vietnam, Second World War. And this is what happens. Like every time America is involved in a major war, Hollywood starts making war films. Hollywood will always make what it can sell and what its audience can relate to, because that's what they'll buy. And if its audience are watching war happening every night on the evening news, that's relatable to them, so let's give them that. Hollywood will never deliberately set out not to make a profit. It's a profit-driven enterprise and therefore is as much a reflection of the audience it's selling to as it is something that directs the thoughts and the opinions of its audience. It's a vicious cycle. Yeah. It's like that is not a, you know, it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not, Hollywood doesn't tell you what to think, but also Hollywood is not going to say anything that it doesn't have a reasonable belief that you already think, because cinema audiences don't like to be challenged, and if you challenge a cinema audience, they vote with their wallets and your movie's a flop. It's just how that works. Hi, Mags. So yeah, this comic strip is very much in that tradition.
Yeah.
As is this movie, as is this graphic novel.
Well, I'd say more this comic strip is poking fun at that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, the comic strip for me it's a satirization of the post-Desert Storm high and militaristic mentality that took hold for a little while. Because America had a good, what would you say, 5 years between Desert Storm and 9/11?
Yeah.
Where it was untouchable.
Now, I take it more as a satirization of how much the Marine Corps in particular.
Oh God, absolutely,
Yeah,
yes. Leonidas pisses by the numbers. Leonidas absolutely pisses by the numbers. Don't
Yeah.
at me.
Like
It's very much a satire of the Marines, but
yeah,
it is also of that wider American mentality that allows that mentality of the Marines. Like that mentality is so glorified in American media. Like every strong character, every manly man is an ex-Marine, or there's
yeah,
no such thing as an ex-Marine, and it's like
yeah.
looking at it from the outside. Honestly, the damn thing's a cult. I don't know how you people like. I don't get it.
And I will admit this is a joke from the Army, but there are only two branches in the military: the Army and the Navy. The Air Force is a corporation, and the Marine Corps is a cult.
I have no argument, no notes.
Yeah.
Excellent commentary, no notes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've talked about that and around that to give people time. Let's see what people are saying in the chat about what comes into mind when you think of Sparta.
Yeah. So far we have just
Mage with shooting the messenger. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That the way they don't obey standard guest host relations, the quote unquote blasphemy of shooting the messenger.
Yeah.
I noticed who was it? So yeah. Scum are talking about, this is fapping to fascism a little bit, but more so the movie than the comic. The comic does stray into that a little bit, but there is an air within the comic of it's positioned in such a way it is more of a satire than a
which is why I said
glorification.
I have disagreements with that statement.
Yeah.
Now I will say in the in the terms of kicking the messenger, they're like, this is probably the only mention of the This is Sparta scene that is going to be in the stream, probably, because once again I am going to be deconstructing that scene in a future video.
I have some commentary on it, but I'm going to leave most of the deconstruction of that to you.
Yeah. But like in that scene in the comic book, in the graphic novel, it's not just something that like the way that the graphic novel is laid out. It's not just Leonidas saying it to the messenger. Frank Miller is telling the audience, this
is madness. This actually is madness. It very much conflates madness and Sparta in a way the movie doesn't.
And goes, it's basically pulling back to tell the audience that Sparta is the kind of society that will
absolutely breach etiquette and
and will just straight up murder an diplomatic emissary.
Yeah, I mean, to put this into modern perspective, this is absolutely the equivalent of marching an ambassador into a city square and putting a bullet in his head.
Yeah,
that's it. That's the in front of the world news. That's absolutely the equivalent of kicking that man down the well. That is.
Yeah.
And that way, it's as big a no-no then as it is now. They use the word blasphemy, which I do have a discussion on later. But I want to come to this. What do you think of when you think Sparta? I can see Maggie in the comment there saying hyped up patriotism for the win.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm sure that was. I think that was more a reply to our discussion about the post.
Yeah, about the the way America receives this kind of media.
Yeah.
But it's a fair comment on Sparta as well. And America has a history of trying to make itself, like, to steal the gravitas of ancient cultures as and when it likes. So you all know I'm a classicist, so I have a lot more floating around my head of what Sparta is to me. But even when I think of it, I think of, Sparta, where the men are men and so are the women. Where the famous laconic wit of, with your shield or on it, if I were you, I would surrender. Well, if I were you, so would I.
Or we'll fight in the shade.
We'll fight in the shade. Tonight we dine in hell. This is it's always being attacked and need to be on the offense before they get us, and that's a mindset. It's not a reality. It is very much a mindset that Sparta embodied as well. If you know about Sparta,
here's a hot take. The Romans were more laconic than the Spartans.
I mean, Latin is far easier to be laconic in than Greek.
No, I mean in mindset.
I mean, yeah, because the Romans basically modeled themselves after the Spartans in much the same way America does. But America also models itself after Rome. So is that a direct?
Well, because so let me put it this way. The Peloponnesian Wars stretched on for nearly a century because Athens kept winning on the sea and Sparta kept winning on the land. When Rome was faced by a similar problem during the Punic Wars, they turned their sea battles into land battles.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's a very short TLDR of two wars in the ancient world and how the strategies differed. But, you also get this thing. I don't know if anyone's heard of Spartan black broth. Like, even what the word Spartan means to us in modern day, it means sparse, it means bare, it means hardship and cold and hunger and starvation. And, it's not a great thing. And then you get this mentality of the noble sacrifice, dying honorably, a quote unquote beautiful death. Toxic masculinity up the wazoo. It's war is the culture, and the culture is war, and very much feeds itself that way. And this comic doesn't shy away from that, and neither does the film. And if anything, I will say, like, I don't have a lot of good things to say about the film. I have a lot of opinions on Snyder's additions to the narrative, which I'm sure we'll get into. And I have even more opinions on what he did with what he actually did put into the film.
Yeah.
But when you look at, from an authenticity's point of view, of the mentality of the characters, the way they presented themselves, their absolute mind-numbing adherence to this fascist mentality, that's fairly accurate. Well, it's not accurate because some of the language differs. They use Christianized terminology. There's some there's some weird Americanness in there. But for an American audience, if you wanted to explain to an American audience what a fascist state was like, that movie's how I do it. That's the no notes. Just that. And that would be, authentic for an American audience, using languages they understand, terminology they understand, but making it just foreign enough that it doesn't make them uncomfortable and start looking too closely at their own culture. Because you can't do that in Hollywood, because that's how you don't make a profit.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, and, like, sometime we're just gonna have to do like an episode on Zach Snyder as a director, and that means I'm going to have to watch Watchmen.
No. We're not going to do an episode on Zack Snyder as a director because everything we want to say is going to be said in this stream because you're not getting my blood pressure up that high twice. I'm not allowing it. My doctor says no.
Or rather, Zack Snyder as a
walking the Adurzo line.
Yeah, as a probably fascist propagandist.
Probably.
I am.
You're avoiding the lawyers.
Yes.
With that state, that's a very diplomatic statement.
Yeah, I am being diplomatic. Though, I mean, we all see how the Spartans treat diplomats.
Mage Grey Wolf's comment, please.
The most recent one?
Yes. Absolutely yes. And he wasn't the only one to have a funny mustache or weird views on eugenics. It's a thing. Yeah. Dictators, they have funny mustaches and they do eugenics. That Venn diagram is a circle.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just, yeah. Absolutely. But the reason we say all this is because actually what Miller's done within the text of the graphic novel is satirize that.
Yeah.
And the thing with satire is it's not good satire if you have to question if it's satire, if you don't have to question if it's satire. Yeah. Like, if there is the possibility that satire can be taken straight, it's good satire. That's the point. Because the point of satire is to needle at the difference between the reality and the ideal of a situation. And to walk between those two lines and to explore why the difference is there and to occasionally poke fun at why we are not closer to the ideal as we'd like to be. And that's what satire is in a very traditional sense. That's what Swift was doing. That's what the 17th century satirists were doing. And that's what I think Miller is doing here.
Yeah. Well, and once again, and to elaborate, when we're talking about the text of the piece, because, 300 is a graphic novel, we're not just talking about the text on the page, we're actually also talking about the art.
Yes,
because
the artwork, the color schemes, the design.
Because, in a graphic novel, in the medium of comic books, the art depicted tells as much of the story as the words, perhaps even more so.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that. And the reason I asked you to bring up Mage Grey Wolf's comment is because of something that said, I think on like the first 2 pages of the graphic novel, there's a part that's talking about the setting the scene, and it's Dear Laconia, Sacred Sparta. And if you do not draw from that the mental image of people stood up, you can either draw the mental image of kids pledging allegiance or kids pledging allegiance. Yeah. Look, America, you're weird. Like, the Pledge of Allegiance is just odd to the rest of the country. Like, there's only other 2 countries, like, since the 20th century that do that. There's only one that still does it, and that's North Korea. Yeah. So, like, yeah. Please just don't. It's, yeah. It's creepy. Stop it.
And what most American school children do is tame to compared to what I did, for 6 years of my schooling.
Yes, but you went to like Christo-fascism, the college.
Yeah.
You went to like a mini Christo-fascist training center.
Yeah.
So Yeah, you probably have a lot more to say on this than I do,
Yeah.
because I went to a school that made me pray 4 times a day, but I didn't have to stand up and pledge that I'd take a bullet for the Queen. You know,
Yeah.
you don't do that unless you join the military in the UK, because that's weird.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of the reason I never got an offer. For some strange reason. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. You open to this scene and they talk, there's this line of "we march," and did you,
Yeah.
again, I'm glad you brought up that thing about we're looking at the imagery as well, because I looked at that panel and I saw orcs. I saw fantasy orcs, spears in formation, and that was very much a visual shorthand for, you know, that mindless horde of warriors. That's what that was a visual shorthand for. It's definitely tapping into that. You know, this is 1997. It's definitely post D&D. It's definitely post Tolkien. They're all.
I mean,
for.
it's post Tolkien, but it's pre Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
Jackson is what, you know, is the one who brought the Lord of the Rings successfully to the screen.
Yeah. But you know, yes, it's orcs, but it's also orcs comes with its own baggage. Orcs are cannon fodder. Orcs are mindless soldiers. You know, and that's what this is. Immediately sets in your mind in the first couple of panels.
Yeah.
And then undercuts with Stumblius, which immediately we have the conflation of honor and glory, but then we do have it drives home the hardships these guys are going through. 3 days without food or water on a hard march carrying gear.
Yeah.
That's nowhere near historically accurate, folks. And that's all I'm going to say on that. They were not carrying their own gear. They had slaves for that. But, you know, this blind obedience of, you know, being... There's a bit in it where he falls over.
Yeah.
And the captain has a go at him. And he reacts by... with a line that would not be out of place in a kinky fan fiction. With the words, "I accept my punishment gladly." And it's like...
No,
is
he,
you kinky? Like, is this... What am I reading? Like, is this...
Like, no, he
kinky?
doesn't... Like, so he stumbles, and then the captain starts beating the shit out of him and knocks him over. And I accept my punishment, you know.
Yeah. I don't think he says gladly, but the way he words it, it very much is very kinky. Like, there's a... Like, I can see why there would be fan fictions of this.
Yes.
And the idea that... And also, just, it doesn't make any sense to beat your own soldiers on the way to the battle. It's like, you're already down on men. You've already only got 300. Why the hell are you beating them half to death?
Yeah.
Killing them, potentially. Because they're showing, like...
And
it makes no strategic sense, but it makes perfect ideological sense.
And the thing is, the captain straight up would have beaten him to death if Leonidas hadn't stepped in.
Yeah, because Leonidas is immediately presented as the man with more brains than brawn.
Yeah.
He is the sole, I think... He's the one person in this graphic novel who has something resembling redeeming features.
Yeah.
And that's deliberate. He's the king, so if he's redeemed, the whole country's redeemed, the whole nation state is redeemed. Except for the fact that you see that the things he does that make him redeemable to a modern audience, no one else agrees with him.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah.
And, you know, and also I'm actually going to say this to put a pin in the that I'll bring up later in the conversation, is portrays Leonidas as a Greek hero, and I'm going to take that pin out much later.
Yeah, because I do want to discuss the difference between how Miller and Snyder handle Leonidas.
Yeah.
There is one thing though. Did you spot the nod to Kubrick in this? So, as I said, American cinema likes to call back to itself. Does that?
Yeah.
Character stumbles and everyone is left without food. Where have you seen that before? Where have you seen the entire company punished because one showed weakness? You've seen that in Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah.
You've seen that with Private Pyle stood on a box eating a donut while the rest of them are forced to do push-ups.
Yeah.
And it's this thing of American cinema is very cyclical and self-referential.
Yeah.
You know, it's... What follows this makes reference to this, but this does make reference to Kubrick. And it creates, again, it's that mentality of, and again, straight away, you're in there with the Marines because there were Marines in Full Metal Jacket. This is an elite force. And it's that mentality going on. And in the stories, you know, great warriors are God-given and blessed. It's innate. Like, you can train someone and train someone and train someone, but if they're not born to fight, they're not going to fight.
Yeah.
And it's just... But the thing is, in Sparta, if you didn't fight, you didn't get your citizenship at 30 years old and you became a social outcast. That was a fate, frankly, worse than death.
But what's most important in this scene is the line at the end. We march in shame.
Yes. Because the shame of one is the shame of all.
Yeah.
And then you have this story. The boy, never given a name. The boy. Because his name's not important because he's archetypical of what a Spartan should be.
Yeah.
If you give him a name, it's a personal story. If you call him the boy, it's an ideal.
Yeah.
It tells the story of this initiation. We have historical accounts of initiations like this. The sons, about 1920, were sent out and they had to basically live in the wild for a year and a day with nothing. And if they survived, they could come back and join the army.
Yeah.
In the historical account of Leonidas, he is attacked, but he's not attacked by a wolf. He's attacked by a helot. The helots were the underclasses of Spartan society. The slaves, the workers, the agriculture, the farmers, etc., etc.
Yeah.
They were not respected. They did not have citizenship. You know, they were very much they were the population who had been taken as slaves from previous military incursions, etc.
And they were the reason why Sparta was so gung-ho about being the best soldiers ever, because they had to be the privileged upper class had to be on the ready to put down a Helot uprising.
Yes. And the idea that the boy fights the wolf defenseless. Again, this is allegory for Sparta against the Helots. If you want to take it as allegory for America in the global war on terror, especially as allegory for what America thought of itself, as Maggie said earlier in the chat, there's an argument to be made there.
Yeah.
But this is what it takes to be king of Sparta. And this is pure propaganda. Like, it's not even pretending it's not propaganda. It's pure propaganda. It's a bedtime story for the soldiers. It's a Grimm's fairy tale of its era. Like, it's a bedtime story.
So this is where I am going to have to, however begrudgingly, praise Zach Snyder for a change that he made when adapting the graphic novel. Because in the graphic novel, the fight with the wolf, the wolf, it's them, like, it's a panel of them staring down, the wolf charges, and the boy thrusts with his spear.
Mm-hmm.
In the movie, the boy backs into a crevice, which is a foreshadowing of what the 300 will do at Thermopylae.
Yeah, it's very much a visual foreshadowing there.
Yeah, and that's in order for intellectual honesty, I have to give props to Snyder for that.
Yes, props for that bit. But what I want to give props to here is Miller.
Yes.
Because how he takes that propaganda story, which is very much pitched as a propaganda story, tell us a story, the soldiers around the campfire, and then contrast that with the way Leonidas behaves in the present. 40 years later, it says he still shows no fear. It says he shows no fear, but then immediately undercuts that by what he does show: a heightened senses, sleeplessness. He calls the soldiers under his command boys in his charge. It's very much the old soldier with PTSD looking at the idealistic young boys who don't understand what war is yet.
Yeah.
Going on there.
And
1,000-yard stare going on.
And it also...
but there is a valorization of PTSD there, but it's a satirization of that because it doesn't shy away from the PTSD symptoms.
And it also, shows the, Spartan soldiers as, as childlike in the worst ways and eagerly lapping up the propaganda that Delios is, putting forth with his bedtime stories. And
for me, this few panels, I think it's like a page. This page for me is very much Miller's Dulce Decorumist.
Yeah.
That's what he's getting at here. Like, these boys think it's a great, glorious thing to die for your country.
Yeah.
And all Leonidas can think about is these boys don't know what war is.
Well, and also that it also is lampshading or lampooning their blatant hero worship of, the great Führer, Leonidas.
Yes, absolutely. And Leonidas is very much idealized through that story, and it calls back to that story a lot through it. But whether it's true or not, obviously the wolf is an analogy for a helot, but again, I think that story comes to us from Plutarch. Take Plutarch with a pinch of salt as well. Like, just take it as read that any ancient source you read should be taken with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
Especially if it's the only ancient source that tells that story in that way. While we're on the topic, laconic weight, very unlikely, probably more authentic than accurate when given in any story you read.
And
so yeah.
So, and also, as soon as I give props to Zach Snyder, for his visual foreshadowing, I have to take away the props from Zach Snyder for cutting out this scene.
And then we go to the flashback to the arrival of the ambassador. Yeah. Not going to linger on this one, but a few comments I want to make. And if Ring wants to add to them or save them for your video, go ahead. Yeah. The visuals of it, the colors change, they're brighter, it's daytime, it's a marketplace, peacetime versus wartime, war is hell.
Yeah.
As above. Yes, if you are on a salt restricted diet, I would say be careful.
Yeah, I think we might as well be in We may as well be in Carthage by the end of this stream.
Yeah, I mean, we're already halfway there. I'm very salty about the movie. the ambassador introduces himself, ambassador of Great Xerxes. Now, there's a Miller's attempt at laconic wit here is very bad. Like some of the insulting the guest, talking about how he stinks and women's perfume, the arrogance of the Spartans. Please let me just. Okay. It's bad, but it is authentic to what the Spartans were like and the mentality of the Spartans. It's not witty enough to be laconic wit, but it is absolutely the kind of nonsense Spartans would come out with.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say I don't think that the scene with the with the ambassador and the two random Spartans, which once again is cut from the movie, was supposed to be an example of laconic wit. Is just like, hey, the Spartans are arrogant dicks.
Yeah, basically. So again, but there's bits where Leonidas makes the comment in the comic as well. And I'm just going to read what I've got written here about the ambassador. Yeah. I'm just going to read it word for word. And I quote, of black people in comics.
Hold on. That's a restart. I went to solo you, but then I accidentally removed you.
Technical difficulties, folks. You know it's going to be a good stream. Okay, so I've written here, I've seen worse art of black people in comics, but that's a very low bar. Also, the Persians weren't black. Persia is modern-day Iran. Scummer in the chat knows exactly how low that bar is for black people in comics because we did the Asterix comics together. It's not that bad, but it's on the line.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just be aware of that one. Like, yeah. I don't like. I think that's one of the that I cannot justify as satire. That's just. I can see how Miller is influenced by a history of comic books in how he draws black characters, but that doesn't make it okay, especially when he's satirizing the genre.
I was gonna bring up how the Persians are depicted, and the only explanation I could give that could be seen as positive, the only way I could put the depiction of the Persians in any kind of a positive light is perhaps saying that we are seeing the Persians through a Spartan lens.
Potentially, yes. But this text, the whole text does read like the bedtime story never ended and we're hearing the bedtime story. Like that's the framing device. That's why that bedtime story's there, to frame the entire thing as one man telling the story and telling the legend. But it's still icky. I don't like it.
Yeah. Like that, like maybe that makes it a little more, like maybe that makes it a little more, palatable, is we are seeing through the Persians through the lens of fascists who are already dehumanizing them.
I don't think it makes it more palatable, but it certainly explains it.
Yeah.
And especially when you then follows up with the comment from Leonidas of they're good hosts, and his appearance in which the entire marketplace stops because they have respect for him.
Yeah.
The earth and water exchanges in the comic is much better than in the film. Does this mean I have to now talk about Sparta and boy lovers?
Yeah.
I filled 2 pages with rants on this one, folks. So, yeah. Okay. So, in the comic and in the movie, Leonidas calls the Athenians boy lovers. Now, there's a lot going on in that statement. And none of it's pleasant. So, blanket trigger warning for everything I'm going to discuss. Homophobia abounds. Take that as read that I don't approve of it.
Yeah.
It's a very modern opinion to call the Athenians boy lovers. Spartan men absolutely fucked each other, and 12-year-old boys were routinely put with an older male at the agoge in order to learn the culture, but also to have sexual practice with. That was normal. It happened with girls as well, given to older women. Not so much, but it happened. To the point where there is a story, maybe apocryphal, but we're seeing some evidence of it. The story goes that the women in ancient Sparta, on their wedding night, shaved their heads so that their husbands could be more easily acclimatized to sleeping with a woman instead of a man. Because men were not allowed to grow their hair until they achieved citizenship. So they were always had shaved heads. How accurate that is up for debate, but it is very authentic to the idea of what Sparta was like for young men. And you have to understand the idea of Leonidas even caring that the Athenians slept with each other of the same sex is ludicrous. Because in ancient Greece, they didn't have a sex-based model of sexuality. Their model was a penetration, reception model of sex and masculinity. And what mattered more was, were you the penetrator or were you the receiver? To put it in, were you the top or the bottom, basically. It was top-bottom discourse. A boy in ancient Greece, the slang would have been a prostitute. Not a young man, a prostitute. So what that's getting at is not that they slept with young men, but that they slept with young men who prostituted themselves, and in doing so, gave up their right to certain civic liberties. Like, if you prostituted yourself, you lost certain rights. You couldn't stand for certain offices. You couldn't vote in certain things. So it was, it was very much a shameful thing to do. Especially if you were born free and born with the opportunity for citizenship. Now, also in ancient Greek art, you have to realize that in the sort of 200 years prior to when this story is based, Athenian art does show pedestry, older man, younger boy relations. But as you get closer and closer to this era, the boys get younger in the artwork. And they go from being 17, 18, which, while not as icky, is still to our modern sensibilities very icky. But they go from being, reasonably capable of consent to being 12 and under, which, ew. And that's so this comment works in a lot of different ways, and in some ways it doesn't work. But it's presented to the audience as a very clear, look, I'm going to say the word once and then not again. Basically, it's used as a synonym for the word faggot.
Yeah.
That's not what it meant. You were a boy lover if you slept with prostitutes. While it was normal, it was still, there was still the same stigma we would have today. There was still the idea that if you were the penetrated rather than the penetrator, you had feminized yourself, you were no longer a man. Like, it was acceptable for boys up to about 17 to be penetrated anally, or to be the receiver in intercurial sex, which is between the thighs. But after that point, it was shameful if you sought out that kind of sex and liked that kind of sex. There was a definite, You know, if you're willing to bend over for another man, you're not any kind of a man, you're a woman kind of attitude. And please no one take that out of context of me explaining that.
Yeah.
But that's where that's going, and it's all bound up in ideas of reputation and honor and masculinity. How can you be a good warrior if you act like a woman in bed? Is broadly what it boils down to. So there's a lot going on there. You've got, and within the context of the history as well, there is a Spartan-Athenian rivalry.
Yeah.
And that will break out into all-out war within about 50 years.
Yeah.
Give or take. This battle was 480. The Delian League, actually, it's a lot sooner than that. The Delian League is founded in 478, so 2 years later.
And it will rage on until just
the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, just before, Alexander of, Macedon just takes everything over.
Yeah, Alexander the So-So.
Yes. Alexander the many epithets.
Yes, Alexander of the many names. Yes. So I wanted to get all that out there because there's a lot going on in that comment. Do I believe that either Miller or Snyder fully understood the implications of that comment when they put them in Leonidas' mouth? No. I think that is pure and simple, blatant late 90s homophobia.
Yeah.
From both of them. And I think Miller had to comment on it. But the way it's done, I mean, look, no one said that propaganda and the way people talk about other cities and other cultures is logical.
Yeah.
But it's no different. Him calling the Athenians boy lovers, it's like Americans, and I won't repeat the words, but we've all heard our fair share of, get a soldier drunk and they'll start coming out with some quite problematic names and terms for enemy combatants in whatever war they were in. You've got I'll use Vietnam as an example, as none of us have any kind of direct. Neither of us on stream have direct link to that. There was Charlie. The actual term that Americans generally are taught to refer to the Vietnamese forces, the anti-American Vietnamese forces in Vietnam, is a slur. It's not it is a slur.
Or I will bring up one from the GWAT.
Be very careful what you say next. There's a reason I avoided it, because I've heard what the things you used to refer to them as, and I appreciate you were a soldier in a war zone, so I let it slide. But yeah, please be careful.
We took a term that's culturally an honorific and used it as a slur.
Yes. And to draw an even more direct comparison, there were several off-color comments about the, shall we say, how safe the livestock were in the local area.
Yeah.
Made by American soldiers that are more akin to this kind of what this is doing. Like, this is him calling them boy lovers is very much akin to an American soldier talking about how the goats probably shouldn't be left alone with the enemy.
Yeah,
and that's as far as I'm going to go on that one.
Or to go for a more ancient example, maybe how the pre-Athenians would call the Cretians bullfuckers.
Yeah, basically. And again, none of it appropriate, none of it, fair. All of it propaganda, but very much it's the mentality. It's what soldiers are like. And it's what propaganda does. It dehumanizes the enemy. It dehumanizes the other to the point where you're absolutely willing to kill them without thought. That's what military training is for. Military basic training, I need to get this rant out. Military basic training is not to get you fighting fit. There's a reason most militaries have entry requirements for fitness. It's because they are not training you to fight. What that 12 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is mainly designed to do is to utterly dehumanize the enemy and break you mentally and then rebuild you into someone willing to kill another human being in close quarters. That's what basic training's for. It's not to teach you how to fight. Like, what the fuck use is a pudgel stick gonna be to you in combat? Like, the fuck? You know, they don't train you how to shoot. They just test to make sure you can get it in the general direction. Like, you know, they don't train you how to actually fight. What they train you to do is to look at the enemy and see a monster.
Yeah. Well, and
again, Full Metal Jacket, just watch the first act of Full Metal Jacket and you'll see exactly what that's doing, everything down to the rhymes and they break them, rebuild them, turn them into the kind of people who are happy to kill other human beings.
Well, the thing is,
and then you have monsters on both sides, but that's my civilian bleeding heart.
Well, and the thing is, at least in the American Army, technically it's everybody except for the infantry that goes through basic.
Yeah, but the infantry goes through a boot camp, don't they?
So the way the U.S. Army works is you have basic and then you have AIT. So your basic is eight weeks of getting broken down, and then AIT is the training you receive for the job you'll actually do, and that the length of that varies depending on what your job in the military is going to, job in the Army is going to be. Infantrymen have what's called OSIT, which is one station unit training. And it's basically like super basic. Like, it's basic and their and their job training, but their job training is just shooting. So it's like basic. It's extended basic. It's essentially.
Yeah. So this is what I mean by basic training is not designed to train you to fight. It's designed to train you to have the mentality to fight. And this kind of feeds into the commentary from the ambassador before he's kicked down the well. He tells them, this is blasphemy. You are arrogant. This is blasphemy.
Yeah.
And that's not just... Okay, first of all, the idea of blasphemy very much existed in ancient Greece, just wasn't that word. I don't know what the Greek word is because I don't speak ancient Greek. But yes, blasphemy is very much the word you would use there. Hubris, arrogance. Yes, that's what that is.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand, treating your guests well, having a level of etiquette as a guest and as a host, and the guest-host relationship in ancient Greece was a religious requirement.
Yeah.
It wasn't just good manners. It was a religious requirement. And this behavior of what he does to the messenger, I genuinely cannot come up... This is a declaration of war.
Yeah.
And it's not just a declaration of war. It's a declaration against your own gods and the rules they've laid down. So it's a declaration of an unjust, blasphemous war. However you want to take that and apply that to the context of 2006 when this movie was released, have fun.
Yeah. And funnily enough, and this is probably going to be the only thing I say about this in this stream, is the bit that that's blast, that he is violating hospitality is actually a little bit clearer in the movie. because the movie specifically states that the ambassador was being entertained while he was waiting, which makes him a guest.
Yes. But again, he's the ambassador. You don't, like I said earlier, what he's done there is the equivalent of walking the ambassador into a city square and putting a bullet in his head. Like, that is a declaration of war. There's no country on the planet that's not going to take that as a declaration of war. You know, and then the comic immediately cuts to the splash page for the next chapter, duty.
Yeah.
So we had honor, now we have duty. And the thing this comic does really well that the movie kind of fails to do is you are never in any doubt that Leonidas has made his bed.
Yeah.
Like, this is all happening because Leonidas couldn't control his fucking temper.
Now, is it something the movie fails to do, or is it something the movie explicitly and purposely does not do? That is up for debate.
What's also up for debate is, does it matter?
Yeah. I think it does matter as to whether or not Snyder has crossed the Adurzo line. And for those of you who haven't seen my tweet defining it, or who haven't watched Scummer and Noodle's asterisk streams, the Adurzo line is the gray area between ignorance and maliciousness.
When it comes to how you represent certain political ideas.
Yeah.
So, yes, Leonidas very much has made his own bed, and now his 300 men are going to lie in it.
Yeah.
And that's what happens with kings. He's a king. His decisions don't just impact him. And there is this tension throughout the story of Leonidas the man versus Leonidas the king. Yeah. Leonidas the man is a family man, loves his wife, has his set ideas. Leonidas the king is an arrogant prick, but also a PTSD-ridden veteran. Like, there's no two ways about that. Very much PTSD-ridden. And there's that tension between who he is and who he presents himself as. And that's an interesting area of discussion. But I'll leave that because I think that's a discussion you can do better justice to when you talk more about the This Is Sparta scene.
Yeah, though
because it's that conflation of Sparta versus madness and how Leonidas kind of embodies that. He is both Sparta and he is madness.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So
that sounded really pretentious, sorry.
And so I think you did get that a little bit backwards, where Leonidas the man is, PTSD riddled veteran. He doesn't. Leonidas the king tamps that down to appear as the strong heroic figure for his men.
No, I didn't get that backwards. That was deliberate the way I worded it.
Okay.
Because the point is that the king cannot exist without the man, and the man does not exist without the king. And the two, therefore, again, it's that symbiotic relationship of man and king. A lot of symbiotic relationships going on here. They are integral to satire.
Yeah.
Like, if you are reading a satire, you are reading something that has a symbiotic relationship within itself. Because otherwise, how do you point out the difference between the reality and the ideal unless you have both feeding into the story?
And also a symbiotic relationship with the reader, because if you do not take satire critically, bad things happen.
I mean, even if you do take it critically, bad things can happen, but they're less likely to happen because you actually see the point that's been made and you don't mistake it for something entirely different.
Yeah.
So we get on to duty, and we immediately have this. We have the. I've written some notes on the splash page. It's the shield is front and center.
Yeah.
With the very obvious Mars symbol, the masculinity. The same symbol we still use in most Western militaries to denote rank.
Yep.
The chevron. Stood against a hunter's moon with a spear. This is that callback to the wolf story. And he's ready to fight. It's that PTSD in there. And then you get blood spatters, but the blood spatters on the comic book are very cleverly placed. Did you notice this? They break over the boundary of the panel.
Yeah.
They breach the boundary of the story and the page.
Yeah.
And it would take a lot to tease out the exact meaning of that, but it's not an accident. It is deliberate. And it is designed to say that, look, war is all-encompassing and crosses lines. And lines have been crossed here and blood will be spilt accordingly. And then we go straight back to Leonidas in the present, talking about his restless, eager youths and how Leonidas is frustrated. I copy and pasted the box here. It was restless, frustrated. All his 50 years had been a straight road to this one gleaming moment of destiny, this one radiant clash of shield and spear and sword and bone and flesh and blood.
Yeah.
That is A, classic glorification of warfare.
Yeah.
B, classic satirization of the glorification of warfare, because it's that conflation of glory with damage and destruction. And C, it's kind of classic PTSD as well, because it's that run-on sentence of ba-dum, 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 ba-dum.
Yeah.
And it's a heartbeat. It's a, shield and spear and sword and flesh and blood. And it comes at you so fast.
And
it's a very clever...
it's all stuff that rushes over you when you're reliving a battle.
Yeah. It's a run-on sentence that builds the tension and ends on blood. The same blood that is just splattered across the line of the previous panel.
Yeah.
And that's, again, it's not an accident. And then we see this idea that they're thwarted not by brawn but by brain. The idea that the Athenians and the Persians are gluttons. The Persians are very feminized. There's a lot of jewelry going on. This boy lovers comment is made again. Again, that comment it's authentic, because in 1997, when an audience is reading this, the worst thing you can be is gay.
Yeah.
Like, second only to being a paedophile, and it's also insinuating that. Strongly insinuating that if you don't understand the Greek history, and who's reading 300 in 1997 and knows the Greek history realistically? They're just not. Same with the movie. But it's deliberate, because they're gluttonous, they're feminized, they're weak. If you're gluttonous, you're not a strong fighter, you're not fast, you don't have stamina, because you're soft and you've eaten too much, and it's all about othering, and it's the us versus them, it's the feminization. And this is the point I'm going to hand over to Analyst Ring to talk about the othering of Iran in the early 2000s.
Yeah. So, okay. Yay.
You already have American citizenship. You can say it. I have to be careful. No, I'm teasing, but, it's... Yeah.
So, okay. Now, I have to put a disclaimer that is, this is my opinion. However, it is an opinion that is informed by my 3 years plus training working as an intelligence analyst during the global war on terror. Um. So, well, one. Aside from, okay, before we get to my opinion, yeah, can you tell that this topic was just sprung on me? So before we get to this opinion,
okay. What I'm basically getting at is
yeah,
I want you to give a viewpoint as someone who served in the military in around that era, a little bit later, but around that era, of how the American mentality very much mirrors the Spartan mentality in othering Middle Eastern cultures.
Oh, okay. Well, more specifically, it's obvious in both the graphic novel and in the, well, more so in the graphic novel than in the movie, that the Persians are just a stand-in, are basically a stand-in for Iran because, ruthless theocratic state.
With a feminized leader who likes his gold way too much, treats his subjects like slaves.
Yeah.
I'm not saying any of this is accurate to Iran,
Yeah.
but I'm not saying it's not accurate. Like, it's accurate to what Americans were told to think of Iran in the era this graphic novel was released.
I mean,
this movie was released in.
Like the only reason you can't say that, well, there are two reasons that you can't say that this is also a a reference to the Saudis is one, Iran has a pretty much direct line, historic line of descendants to ancient Persia.
Mm-hmm.
And two, America is kind of frenemies with the Saudis, and the Saudis have had a Cold War against Iran since Saudi Arabia was a thing.
Yeah. But yeah, so, but it's also like you have to look at it more broadly in the context of, because this is released post Desert Storm, the movie's Iraq. Look, everyone knows that the way you teach Americans geography is by starting a war.
Yeah.
Like, don't ask an American to point to a country on a map it's never been at war with. They probably can't do it. Even last year, like, what was it? 70% of Americans wanted to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. If you can find me 70% of Americans who can even find Ukraine on a map, then we'll talk.
Well, see, that's why we needed to put boots on the ground, is so we could learn where Ukraine is.
I mean, you're not wrong. But, and that was just one thing that I saw that was obviously like propaganda based, but illustrates the point. In the early 2000s, yes, they were talking about Persia, and that's Iran. But it would be, I think, blinkered not to also accept that in the early 2000s, all those countries in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, were the Middle East to most Americans, most Brits as well, most people in the Anglosphere. Like, everything between sort of Eastern Ukraine and China was, well, are we allowed to say Tibet? But everything in that middle bit was kind of blurry, and no one quite knew which one was which, unless you were unless you either came from there or you'd studied it. Not a lot of people had done that. So when you talked about Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran, Libya, Syria, even in the North African countries, when you talked about Jordan and Israel and Palestine, for a lot of people in the Anglosphere, you may as well have just put a map in front of them and written across those countries, "Here be dragons."
Yeah.
They did not differentiate between who and what those countries were. You know, and that's not an insult. That's just a statement of fact. Like the Middle East was not relevant to the Anglosphere in the late 90s and early 2000s until it was.
And
so yes, this is the Iranians, but especially if you look at some of the language used within the comic and the graphic novel and within the movie, it's obviously conflated with Iraq and Afghanistan as well.
Yeah.
Not correctly, but authentically for the time it was released into.
Like, yeah, because American culture, especially American culture that had anything to do with the GWAT, does have this overall depiction of the Muslim world as a block of backwards theocratic, almost fascistic states.
And a homogeneous block at that. So, everyone thinks everything. It's not true by any stretch, but that was definitely the propaganda we were being fed in that era. But, and it's important to point that out, that when Snyder and Miller, yes, they're talking about Persia, but when they're talking to a 2006 audience, they're also talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, and Syria and Libya and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. They're talking about all those countries.
Like they
don't differentiate because they don't know enough to differentiate.
Like that, like the grenades that Snyder added to this, that was literally just so he can make an Iraq war film in his 300 movie.
Absolutely, yes. The grenades very much, like also the elephants and the rhinos, never would have happened. But again, Miller taking artistic license, because what Miller's telling is a bedtime story for the soldiers. Snyder seems to have missed that and assumed it was a documentary. That's my theory on it. But then we see what happened, and then we get this throwback again to the hard climb up the mountain, to the "we've been expecting you" immediate evil shorthand, and it's the priests. It's the pagan priests, which again, very much American, like pagans must be evil, and
I have a feeling I need that.
No face shown, demanding gold, greedy, inbred. Even a king must bow to them. He resents them. These are very modern ideas. These are very modern ideas. And they are very Christocentric ideas. And they feed into that overview of Sparta as a fascist nation with far more Christian leanings than is really reasonable to expect of an ancient Greek society.
And I mean, they're all, they're even referred to as the priests of the old gods.
Yes, very much so. And they use the gods as a weapon to exalt gold. And I'm just going to read you again what I wrote here. I put, they use the gods as a weapon to exalt gold from Leonidas - I bet Miller's a Protestant. And that's all I wrote there. And I'm just going to let you sit with that comment. Canea, no war on feast days, full moon. It's equivalent to declaring war on Christmas. Do I remembering something about there were to be no military incursions on certain days and stuff when you were in the military? I can't remember. Or was that like a propaganda thing I've absorbed and not questioned?
Well, like even historically, like from the very beginning, like remember, like it's a brilliant meme is, and it's historically factual. There's a picture. The picture is Washington crossing the Delaware. And the caption says, Americans, we will kill you in your sleep on Christmas.
Yeah, pretty much. And it is that thing of, there was a thing about, wasn't the Tet Offensive a major holiday in Vietnam?
Yeah.
So they assumed there wouldn't be an attack because it was a major holiday.
Yeah, and
so defenses were down.
Oh yeah, and during my tour, there was there was an expectation that attacks would rise immediately before and immediately after Ramadan, but there'd probably be a lull in attacks during Ramadan.
I'm going to say it as well, right? Because I know we have at least one Muslim in the audience, okay? That's not like the terrorists are not Islamic. You know, in much the same way, if the American army invaded a country on Christmas Day, we'd have opinions. I'm sure there are Muslims around the world who have opinions about attacks done during Ramadan and Eid. And during other holidays in the Islamic calendar, which I'm not well versed enough to know what they're called, but I'm sure there are some.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things. You know, you don't assume people are going to attack on their sacred days, because why would you want to answer to your God on why you did that? Frankly,
Yeah.
you know, if you are truly devout, you don't want to answer to your gods on why you disrespected their holy days. Like,
Yeah.
So yeah, anyone who claims to be religious and then does things like that, side eye them. And that's any religion, not just Christianity and Islam. So yeah, there's this thing, and this feeds into Leonidas, because Leonidas is presented as very arrogant. This idea that he thinks he, a tiny speck in a minor city-state in the Hellenic world, has got the right. He thinks he has the right to negotiate with the gods. Buddy, sit down. Sit the fuck down. Okay.
I'm wondering if I should take that pin out.
Take it out if you want.
Well, because I can either take it out now or I can take it out when we get to Xerxes' offer to Leonidas.
Let's leave it there for now. But yeah, this idea of, you know, the oracle versus reason, the idea of superstition versus reason, it's a very monotheistic concept. Like, okay, don't get me wrong, the ancients did have a concept of being too superstitious for your own good. Yeah. Too devout to the point of superstition. And that was actually considered a blasphemy. Like, you if you were so religious that you had superstitions, that was blasphemous to hold those superstitions. But that didn't mean people didn't, you know. The Catholic Church swears blind that it has no teaching on, like, witches and werewolves. But people were sure as hell superstitious about them. You know, and salt and all that other jazz. And it kind of, Leonidas has a very much, is presented as being a bit like a, you know, Gen Z, you know, okay boomer. To the priests, he very much okay boomers them. And there's this other commentary that's made. Now, I don't know how accurate it is. I tried to look, but it's very difficult to Google were oracles the sex slaves of their priests, without getting some weird ass results.
Yeah.
Oracle was a very vaunted position. The idea that it would be a stoned teenage girl who's being, it's insinuated, who is being repeatedly raped by old, gross, icky men who look like they've got the plague or leprosy or some shit.
Yeah.
Nah. Just nah. Like, it was a vaunted, like, it was it was up there with being a cardinal in the Catholic Church. It was up there with being a pastor or a priest. It was not a.
This
This
is
is very much a modern mentality being put on here in order to demonize the priests a bit more and justify Leonidas's behavior.
Yeah.
And as I said, I bet Miller's a Protestant. He's either a Protestant or he's an angry ex-Catholic. I put money on it. And priests as spies, that belongs more in a Soviet-era spy movie than in a 300 one. Whether the priests were spies or not is up for debate. And then we cut back to Leonidas with his wife. And we are treated to what I can only describe as Miller's a kinky fucker. We've already established that, right? He is kinky as fuck.
So Frank Miller grew up in an Irish Catholic family.
Yeah, that explains everything. That explains everything. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
That also explains Frank Miller saying that these priests were sexually abusing the oracle, because if you know anything about Irish Catholic history, 20th century Irish Catholic history, it's gross. It's gross. And I'm not going into it, but there's a movie called The Magdalene Sisters. Trigger warning if you watch it, but it's one of those movies, it's like Schindler's List. You should watch it, but you're not supposed to enjoy it.
Yeah.
So take from that what you will. This scene of with your shield or on it, no goodbye. Again, it's the laconic wit. That with your shield or on it is a very famous Spartan thing.
Yeah.
I think it was Plutarch who wrote it down originally, but don't quote me. Yeah, like even if it wasn't actually said, I can appreciate it being said in the movie and that, because it's such a ubiquitous part of what we understand as Spartan culture.
Yeah, and it was also, in the graphic novel.
Yeah, and it was in the graphic novel. I'm not entirely keen on how Snyder put it together, because the way Snyder did it undercut the entire point. And this is where Snyder, I want to take my pin out of the commentary on women in Sparta. Snyder fucks this up royally. And it is Snyder who fucks it up, because all the stuff in the movie where they go back to Sparta and she's there and all that, none of that's in the comic.
Yeah.
That is Snyder's personal, I want to rape a queen fantasy. That's what's going on there. There's no other explanation for it. It adds nothing to the plot. It is utterly irrelevant and frankly gross. And
I mean,
I'm not one for it. I don't usually look at a text and like, oh, that must mean that the author wanted to do X, Y, and Z because they wrote about it. But why else would you write? This is gross. And when I say text, I do mean the movie. But
yeah, I have a theory.
Other than it humanizing Leonidas by making his wife a victim, you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
Fascist propaganda.
Yes, because the woman takes it and she stands up to it, and she,
Yeah. Because while the brave, soldiers are, and okay, disclaimer, I am phrasing this in the, within the frame of the fascist propaganda. I do not believe this.
Before you say it, it's gross when Ring gives a disclaimer before they say it. Go.
Yeah. So, while the brave few men who are strong enough are off facing the endless hordes, seeking to destroy our civilization, the scheming politicians are literally raping your women behind their back and using it to consolidate their own power and thus and also bring down the downfall of your civilization by betraying everything it stands for.
And that's the threat being made by the enemy as well.
Yeah.
So it's the enemy within. There's also the fact that she takes it in the Spartan way. She doesn't cry. She doesn't scream. There's this false, very poor understanding of Stoicism. And again, it's the incel view of Stoicism.
Yeah.
The social media view of Stoicism, which is give no opinion. But it's very much
like I say some pretty dark shit on the regular. It's bad when I have to disclaimer it.
Yeah, and you have the First Amendment. But yeah, and it's very much this thing of the point of that. The only way I see that being in any way a valid addition to this narrative is if the point of it is to show that the women are as strong, if not stronger than the men, because they can withstand that violation.
Yeah.
And then fight back and get their revenge and kill the guy, basically. Yeah. But the fact that it's coercive rape. Like, it's not consensual, even if it tries to almost make her consent. Like, it forces her into it. Like, there's no two ways about it. He raped her. But it does present it in such a way where if you were a very bad actor, and as in bad actor, you had bad intentions, you could possibly build an argument that she consented to that.
Which she does.
Yeah. And then promptly gets a knife in the ribs.
Yeah.
Couple of things on it, just because we may as well just discuss all that now and then get past it. Women would never, ever have spoken at the Spartan Assembly. Women were not involved in politics in any way, shape, or form. That was not a woman's space. I appreciate why it was done, and it was done specifically to appeal to a modern audience. Like the man looking to his wife for permission, that her appearing at making the speech and trying to get him support. That was done to appeal to a modern audience. I appreciate why it was done. There's no historical accuracy there. The line of "with your shield but on it," she calls him Spartan. That's very. There are texts that would say things like that. We know famously of the mother who told her son, "with your shield or on it." And you will notice as you go throughout the film and the comic, nearly every attested example we have of laconic wit.
Yeah.
In the context of this story is used. So they are very much trying to go, "Oh, look at us, we've done the reading. Yeah, you've done the reading, but you haven't understood it, at least in Snyder's case.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You could say that Miller had understood it because Miller is satirizing it.
Yeah. And Miller is very much satirizing the idea of laconic wit when he puts it in the mouth of a woman.
Yeah.
And it's not the only bit of laconic wit he puts in her mouth. But when he puts it in her mouth, he immediately undercuts that toxic masculine, a man's a man mentality that comes along with laconic wit. And you notice every time Leonidas uses lines that are attested, we will fight in the shade. We dine with Hades. It's in situations whereby he's being an arrogant prick who's clearly trying to push the propaganda.
Yeah.
And the more I think about this, the more I think the comic book especially is very much. The comic book is not designed to tell the comic book is a bedtime story. That's what it is. It's a bedtime story for Spartan children. And And that reading makes way more sense, especially in the scope of the framing device at the beginning, than Snyder's attempt to turn it into a propaganda piece.
Yeah.
Whereas, but in a different way, like he uncritically creates this propaganda piece without framing it as a children's story, and therefore doesn't undercut the propaganda itself.
Yeah.
And that for me is the difference between Miller and Snyder. Like Miller is very much telling the propaganda, but he's telling you it's propaganda.
Yeah.
Snyder's just like, well, here's the propaganda. Isn't this fun?
Yeah.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Now, would you believe that Zach Snyder is very fond of or very proud of the fact, and has proudly proclaimed that he does not, in fact, read comic books?
I absolutely can believe that. And I think more fool him.
Yep.
Because if you are going to go playing around in a genre pool, you should know the genre you're doing. Like, you have to understand a genre in order to satirize it.
Yeah.
Miller clearly understands the genre because it's not the first time he's done it or the last time he's done it. Snyder, do you know, you saying that about Snyder, honestly, it reminds me of two things. Do you remember that kerfuffle a couple of years back when, I don't know what his name goes by now, some symbol, but Kanye West stood up and said, I don't read, I'm not a reader, I don't read books.
Yeah.
That's what that reminds me of.
I think he goes by Yay.
Yay. I don't know. I apologize. I don't mean any disrespect to the identity of the person. I just don't know because I don't keep up with celebrity gossip.
Yeah. We don't mean any disrespect for Mr. West's identity. His politics, on the other hand,
that's what I think of his politics.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very much in that regard. You know, it's Donald Trump going to China and asking if China's older than Egypt. That's it's cringe. It's so ignorant. It's cringe, and it's proud of being ignorant. And I don't like.
But it explains why his adaptations of graphic novel
very much walk the Uderzo line.
Well, is why his adaptations of satires, i.e. Watchmen and 300, uncritically adapt them, and why his Superman movies were why his first Superman movie had such mixed reception, and why the second one just fucking tanked.
Yeah. Now, there is a little bit I want to discuss at the end of this bit of the comic, and it also appears in the movie as well.
Yeah.
The meeting of the Acadians and the Spartans.
Yeah.
Where the Acadians think, because the Spartans have only brought 300 men, that they are shortchanging, basically, and trying to get out of being in a fight. And the response is, yes, but I've brought 300 soldiers. You've brought 300 potters, blacksmiths, and, you brought however many thousands. And the numbers are there in the Herodotus. Again, the links in the description for which cities brought how many. It's a general idea. But that, to me, that moment, again, we've talked a lot about the American military on this stream, and I'm going to bring it up again. Because when I was a little hissy, before I met Ring even, there was something I absorbed in American culture. And I absorbed this through watching TV shows and things, and it's very much that cult of the Marines.
The few, the proud, the Marines.
The Marines, yes. Every Marine is a rifleman.
Yeah.
which I thought was ridiculous and still find odd. Like, why does your chef need to know how to fire a gun? It's weird. Oh, what do you do? Oh, yes, I'm going Italian for a moment. Just go with it. Now, look, that's what Leonidas is tapping into here. Basically, what he's saying is every Spartan is a rifleman.
Yeah.
And, he's a rifleman and then he's a specialist in whatever his thing is. And that's something that I absorbed from a young age that the Marines are very proud of for some strange reason.
Oh,
again, it's part of that cult.
They're like some anonymous Marine made a meme of that, of captions from that scene where the other Greeks are, it's like, so it's army, what, or soldier, what's your profession? I'm a cook, I'm a mechanic, I fly drone pilots. I'm a drone pilot. I'm in logistics.
Yeah. Marine, what's your profession? Hoorah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly what that's tapping into. If you think that was released to an American audience and they didn't make that connection,
yeah,
they absolutely did. Because I made that connection and I'm not even American.
Yeah.
So yeah, very much so. And then, this idea that they are professional soldiers and everyone else are just brave amateurs who did their part.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let the army veteran discuss their feelings on that particular comment, bearing in mind that the Spartans have been made an analogy for the Marines.
Well, I am instead going to quote Napoleon. No, actually, I think it's Voltaire that said it. Is either Voltaire or Napoleon, like either the philosopher Voltaire or Napoleon, or it was some general.
Let's go with some general. It's most likely to be right.
Amateurs discuss tactics. Masters of war discuss logistics.
Yeah. Also, just to point out, for those who have a religious bent, which I appreciate are not many people in our audience, but amateurs built the Ark and professionals built the Titanic. Just putting that one out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, professionals. But then we go in the comic, we get another splash page for the hot gates.
Yeah.
We see the gods play. He talks about the gods playing with humans, clearly holding the gods in contempt, infantilizing them and making them human beings, their toys, their playthings. This idea of Spartan reserve, it's the old soldier trope, isn't it? It's the propaganda.
Yeah.
It's as everyone around him lost their minds, he stood stoic and proud and strong. Like.
Though, interspersed amongst all this, in this chapter, we also have a couple of a few pages here and there of a hunchback figure running, and the block text is proclaiming that he will prove them wrong. He will prove that his parents were right to save him, that he is capable of being a Spartan.
Yeah. And this is particularly problematic because what this comic does and what this movie does is very uncritically conflate disability with treachery. It also conflates being the enemy with being darker skinned and being sexually deviant to various extremes. However, I will say with Miller, I have more patience for Miller doing that, because Miller does then undercut it as part of the satire, whereas Snyder, I hope he never has a disabled child for the child's sake.
Yeah.
It's
well,
gross.
like for
There is one of the articles I linked you is someone basically tearing that apart from a leftist point of view and having a discussion about how, you know, it's ableist, it's sexist, it's racist, it's transphobic, it's all of it, and has that discussion in the thing. Again, take it critically, but it is a point of view worth reading if you're interested in that aspect of it.
Because we can have a full, like, it's probably best to discuss FELTs in one big block. So we do it here, or do we do it when he actually shows up to Leonidas?
Let's put a pin in Caliban for now. And talk about what constitutes a Spartan welcome.
Yeah.
This idea that the Spartan welcome is not again, it's very militaristic, it's arrogant, it's not religiously right. The idea of it again sets up this dichotomy of Xerxes, slavery, bad, evil, feminized.
Yeah.
Spartans free. Now, you can tell me until you're blue in the face that the citizens of a fascist state are free. No, they are not. They've been brainwashed from at least 7 years old, if not younger. They've been beaten and broken and mentally molded into perfect, mindless soldiers who are willing to kill and die on command for simple things like tripping over their shoelace. I don't think the Spartans had shoelaces, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Again, authenticity, not accuracy, folks.
Now,
that's not freedom. That is not freedom. But because the Spartans, by this point, have been conflated both with the American Marines and with America as a society, they then have to make the Spartans the free peoples in this dichotomy of good versus evil. There's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of layers to peel back. You cannot cherry pick aspects of Spartan society and say, oh, look, they're great, they're American, and leave behind what you don't like. You take it all or none of it.
Yeah. Now,
and this is the point I think Miller's making with this commentary.
And also, it feels like, at least in regards to Miller, in the subtext, that when Leonidas is crying on about how the Spartans are free men, we are free and you are slave, and your army is an army of slaves. If in the subtext of the graphic novel, it feels like there is a bit of, the slaveholder crows the loudest about how he is a free man.
Very much so, but also I think this is a reference, and again, I'm going to say this and then put a pin in it because there's a better discussion to be had later. But I think this is potentially it's worth reading this as something of a Monty Python reference of, you are all individuals. Yes, we are all individuals.
Yeah.
And it's not the only Monty Python reference in this book. So I feel perfectly safe in saying that Miller is more than familiar with Monty Python. And therefore that reading is, if not guaranteed to be accurate, at least a valid thing to say. In that, Leonidas undercuts himself by asking, by saying his men are free, and then immediately showing how they are not. Snyder doesn't notice that that's what's being done, and therefore presents it uncritically, and he goes the whole hog with the whole death before dishonor, and the discussion of the phalanx and all that jazz.
And it's also, it come, he says it later, but and once again, this is something that Zach Snyder had cut from the movie, from his adaptation. But Leonidas does say, leave the democracy to the Athenians. And we all know how he feels about Athenians.
Yes, because he's made that abundantly clear early on, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because I've literally got that screenshotted on my page.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then there's also this, when they're discussing the Persians arriving, there's also this, they big up the enemy a little bit. Look, history is not written by the winners. History is written by the people who write shit down.
Yeah.
The Greeks wrote shit down. Okay, and if the Spartans are this great warriors, this near mythologized warriors, and I'm going to say that word, put a pin in it and come back to it at the end of this sentence, then the enemy that destroyed them must be bigger, stronger, more powerful than any other enemy. Julius Caesar does the same thing in the Gallic Wars. He makes his enemies out to be far more competent and capable than they really are, because if my enemies are this good and I beat them, then I'm better. But if my enemies are this good and I lose to them, I'm still pretty good. I'm still pretty, I'm still pretty badass if it took you can say either I beat them, so I must be better than them and more capable than them, or they beat me, but look what it cost them to beat me.
Yeah.
And therefore I didn't go down easy. I went down swinging, and there is honor in that.
Yeah.
So either way, he wins on the propaganda.
They beat me, but those cheaters have a magic potion that makes them invincible.
Basically, yeah. They beat me, but they outnumbered me 50-1.
Yeah.
They beat me, but I went down swinging. I made a god bleed. It took a god to bring me down.
Yeah.
No man could do it. Do you see how that glorifies the mentality of, if the enemy's good, you cannot insult your enemy too much, because if you do, you make yourself either petty or weak, depending on the outcome of the battle with them. If they're so pathetic that you insult them, then why did you go to war with them? That's petty, that's weak, that's vindictive.
I mean,
if you lost to them after insulting them, holy shit, you call the Athenians boy lovers and you lost to the Persians. That's what's going on there.
There's also the what's the word? The fascist. I'm gonna say paradox, even though that's probably the wrong word. Where the enemy is simultaneously, contemptibly weak, but also, a clear and present, an overwhelming danger.
Yes, absolutely. It's a paradox, it's doublethink, it's whatever you want to call it. It's the line in the comic that I have here is 100 nations descended upon us, large numbers, snorting, snarling desert beasts, othering, animalistic.
Yeah.
They're less than human. The armies of all Asia against Greece, pledged to crush the impertinent republics of Greece. Republics. It's important that they call themselves republics.
Yeah.
Because republics in the American psyche as self-determining, even if they're not necessarily democratic. To make slaves of the only free men the world has ever known. That's American exceptionalism right there.
Yeah.
That's not even pretending it's not American exceptionalism. That's American exceptionalism. You know, that's, we are the only free people. We have a constitution. We have a Bill of Rights. You know, we will spread democracy. We will spread our idea of democracy. You know, we will stand up against the oncoming hordes.
Yeah.
And it's that othering again, and using animalistic imagery to portray your enemy, making them violent and vicious and overwhelming, but also dehumanizing them to such an extent that they are pathetic, and that there's an insult built into that. So you are absolutely right. There's that paradox. And I just want to show you this on my screen. I literally wrote the word combat, free, discuss. Are the Spartans free? And I think that's a discussion worth having.
Yeah.
Because the line is given to the Queen, and again, very much Snyder's mind, and is very much designed to appeal to an American audience. The very famous line, "Freedom isn't free." And that's as close as Snyder gets to self-awareness in this movie. Unfortunately, he undercuts that by putting it in the mouth of the woman who is portrayed as being weak-willed, utterly lacking in any political ability, and an utter failure to her husband, who's fighting for his life.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not like Snyder. He puts the words in there, but then he undercuts them. He does the opposite of what Miller does. So Miller puts the words of fascism in there and undercuts them. Yeah. Snyder puts the words of fascism in there and then undercuts the criticism of them.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing, because there's this thing we were discussing Alan Moore's opinion of 300, which I think is worth bringing up. He slammed it in the press. It was just the one interview he gave. And it seems to me, from what I can gather from reading accounts of that interview, that this is 15 years ago, 20 years ago, finding them online is not easy. It seems he made the same mistake Snyder made, in that he didn't realize 300 was a satire. But where Snyder looked at it and went, "Oh, fascism, yay, I'll have some of that." Moore looked at it and went, "Ew, fascism, gross." Yeah. Which, of the two responses, I prefer Moore's, but Moore's still does lack the nuance to discuss a satire.
Which is really ironic, considering how the other, like the two biggest names in the movement that, you know, or, you know, that started the dark comic satire and the uncritical reception thereof were Frank Miller and Alan Moore.
Yeah. So, but I can see why Moore took against it if he didn't, because he called it homophobic, he called it bigoted, he called it ableist, and it is all of those things if you don't read it as a satire.
Yeah.
Which I think it very, like, if I'm reading the narrative as a satire, I then have to take the things like the racist depictions, the ableist depictions, the homophobia, the inaccuracies in order to appeal to a modern audience, and I have to assume that they are also part of the parcel of satire.
Yeah.
And therefore, while I don't like them, I understand that they are potentially satirizing the comic book industry, potentially satirizing racism and ableism within the comic book industry.
Yeah. Well, okay.
And there is an argument to be made there.
While we're on the discussion of Snyder versus Miller, satire versus just telling it, uncritically telling it straight. Like, there's a reason, like, I feel there's a reason that Miller is depicting the Spartans as nearly naked. But, like, so, because if you look at the other Greeks and, and the Persians for the most part, they're all, at least adequately, if not fully clothed.
Yeah,
Miller's doing it in a way as look at these half-naked barbarous savages.
Snyder's going, oh, look, 6-packs.
Yeah, Snyder's going, look at these badasses who don't even wear armor. They're just that good. Look at these muscle men.
Yeah. And the idea as well, and then we get further into it. You get Leonidas who leads from the front. Yeah. And Leonidas in both iterations of this story, in the comic and in the film, is we are supposed to take Leonidas as the person who redeems Sparta.
Yeah.
That's why Leonidas is soft with his wife in Snyder's version. That's why Leonidas looks out for his men in Miller's version. It makes him human.
Yeah.
And so him leading from the front is a very modern.
Everyone is calling Stelios Stumblios until Leonidas calls him by his actual name. And did you see that? The king called me by my name. He didn't call me Stumblios.
Exactly. The king recognizes that I'm human and I'm worthy of basic human decency, which is a thing that is apparently lacking in Spartan culture if you take Snyder's view, and if you take the historical view to an extent as well. Because you've got to realize every Spartan we read about or watch in this movie is someone who at some point someone made a decision that their life was worth living.
Yeah.
And that eugenicism, that fascism, yes, existed in historical Sparta. And no matter what happens, this is the thing with Spartan culture. You can glorify it as much as you want, but don't forget it's built on the backs of slaves and leaving babies out for the wolves.
Yeah, and
it's rotten at the foundation.
Well, and the reason I bring it up, with Stelios or Stumblios, is because even then, he had the captain has to be deliberately ordered to stop hazing him.
Yes, exactly. Because hazing is not strategically viable. And Leonidas is a lot of things. He's arrogant, he's a prick, he's not stupid.
Yeah.
He has his moments, don't get me wrong. Killing a messenger, dude, were you high?
Yeah.
But he's not stupid, especially once he's actually in the war zone. And he knows that if you haze a soldier, that's one less soldier to fight for you. So you can read his kindness both ways. You can read it as kindness. You can also read it as tactical, strategically advantageous, not to break your soldiers before they've seen the enemy. And there's a discussion to be had there about where's the line. Because you need your soldiers to be willing to fight and die. And your soldiers do need to be more afraid of a court-martial than they are of the enemy. Yeah. That's how militaries work. If you're a soldier, but you're more afraid of the enemy than you are of your top brass.
Yeah.
You're gonna go AWOL. You're gonna run. You're gonna if you're a sailor, you're gonna mutiny.
To borrow a line from later, the men at the back cry forward. The men at the front yell back.
And that's a great criticism. That's like, did Bob Dylan write that as a line from Masters of War? Like, that's a fantastic line.
Yeah.
And the men at the back use whips.
Yeah.
You know, and that's very much in the visuals. But we see Leonidas, the difference again, this idea of Leonidas leading from the front, Xerxes watching from on high. It's your Masters of War, isn't it? Standing back, you know, with a brandy while the men fight and die. And again, that's a very modern idea transposed onto this battle, that the weak-willed, cowardly master of war Xerxes watches from on high and doesn't get his hands dirty. It's an aspect of that feminization, of that othering. And yeah, to an extent it's true. Like, you don't put your king on the front line. Like, anyone who plays chess knows you don't put your king in the middle of the board.
Yeah.
Like, that's not how you win a game of chess. But equally, there is honor to be found, and a sense of bravery, a sense of good optics if you are the kind of king who leads from the front.
Yeah.
Who leads your soldiers by doing, or the kind of general who gets down in with the people. And this is a thing again, Julius Caesar, you know, the Napoleon, the Severans, Trotsky. Throughout history, we see repeatedly the people the soldiers like are the ones who come to the front lines. That's why Zelensky's backwards and forwards to the front lines. That's why Boris Johnson thinks he's some kind of hero, because he keeps, you know, heading out there. You know, it's because it's the optics, and directing a battle from behind the battle lines is not good optics, especially to a modern audience.
Yeah.
And there's a great line when he is there and he does face off against Xerxes, and Xerxes makes the threat. Now we've seen the queen raped at home.
Yeah.
And then we see Xerxes say, your women will be raped, and your women and your children and your elders will be slaves. And it's this moment of Leonidas, where Leonidas says, you don't know our women. Because, and that's a tacit acknowledgement, I think, that, look, rape is a war crime. Like, rape in combat is a war crime. But what Leonidas is basically saying is, our women are stronger than that. Our women can take that and they will not break.
Yeah.
And again, it's that militaristic mentality, but it does bear out in the narrative that Snyder created as well.
Yeah.
Do I think it was necessary to put that front and center in front of the audience? No, because Leonidas says that in the comic without the need for us to see his wife brutally raped and taken advantage of. And it makes more sense in the comic, because in the comic she's actually the archetypal Spartan woman. She tells him, with your shield or on it. She tells him, you know, fight to win. She stands proud as a Spartan wife. But in the film, her dignity is undercut harshly. And therefore that comment rings hollow when Leonidas makes it in the film.
Well, also in that in the film version, that confrontation with that ambassador isn't between Leonidas and the ambassador, it's between Stelios.
No, I mean when Leonidas kills the ambassador.
Yeah, and cuts off his arm.
No, I mean right at the start when Leonidas
Oh,
kills the
yeah,
ambassador.
yeah, okay, yeah.
So yeah, but then Stelios cuts off the next ambassador's arm, and it's more of the same. The point is that, and this is something Miller's doing. What Miller says is, even when they assume it's peacetime, even when things are bright and calm and airy, the Spartans will still murder an ambassador.
Yeah.
Who comes bearing bad news. And they do exactly the same thing on a battlefield.
Yeah.
The idea is the Spartan mentality never changes. It is total war all of the time. It's fascism to its core. And basically what that is, for my money, and this is my opinion, that's a criticism of hawk-like tendencies in politicians.
Yeah.
That's saying you can't always act like you're in the middle of a war, because you're not. And if you act like you're in the middle of a war, what you do is start wars.
Yeah.
That's what Miller's saying. Whether Snyder carries that over or not is up for debate. Because that's
no, it's
more
not.
of an
He doesn't. No,
yeah.
It's not. He doesn't.
I was being diplomatic, okay? Being diplomatic. I am capable of it sometimes.
This
like
isn't
I'll have to lay down afterwards because it took a lot of effort. But yeah. So yeah, you don't know our women, and then you see this. And what? Okay. I said this halfway through the film, and when Ring and I watched it together, I'll say it here. The narrator of the film does my fucking head in. It's like most of the lines from the narrator are Leonidas's in the comic, and the narrator does nothing but spoon feed you the fascism without actually communicating the satirical nature of it.
Yeah.
It's just especially when it talks about Xerxes and his hubris. So just from the top, what we have about Xerxes is his men wear perfume, they're feminized.
Yep.
Sparta will not bow to him because the boy lovers didn't bow to him.
Yeah.
The Athenians. Okay. He wears jewelry, he's feminized, he accepts the disabled, he is sexually deviant. His skin color is all wrong for a Persian, just putting that out there. He's all of these terrible things. He's all of these things that are an anathema to what fascism idealizes. He has transgender people in his scene. He has people with scarring. He has there's a lesbian kiss going on at one point.
Yeah.
It's all very deviant. It's very
though this. I'm pretty sure all the sexual deviancy was added by Snyder.
I mean, even still, it is authentic to what Miller was going for with Xerxes, which is that he's. Do you know what he is? He's what Tucker Carlson imagines the left wing is like.
Yeah.
He's a Tucker Carlson wet dream. That's what he is. If you ask someone who watches Tucker Carlson what the left is, they'll describe Xerxes. That's just the best way I can describe that. And therefore Xerxes loses because of his hubris. But it is also implied that his hubris is as a result of his deviancy, his feminization, his otherness, his dark skin, his willingness to accept disabilities, and, his willingness not to take part in eugenics.
Yeah.
He is kind. He repeats this. He is kind. He is kind. He is kind. Because if you repeat something often enough, it becomes truth.
Yeah.
Whereas Miller takes that and makes it dark and twisted, but also shows that actually there's a point there. What Snyder does is sneers those lines and undercuts those lines by showing look, you can live on your knees or die on your feet.
Yeah.
And that's the question that's been posed here. And it's a question of integrity. It's a question of who and what you're willing to fight and die for.
Yeah.
And Snyder is clearly very much of the opinion that they will not bow down to those dirty Middle Easterners. Don't take that out of context. Whereas Miller's point is their culture might have something that's worth looking into, but the story's been told from the point of view of the Spartans, and therefore they dismiss all of that.
Yeah, and also, so that I'm going to pull out my pen.
Yes, I thought you might. Careful, it don't blow. You've got 3 seconds.
So, we get the, Xerxes thinks himself a god. He's revealed his fatal flaw, hubris.
Yes.
The thing is, Leonidas doesn't recognize that he also has hubris in spades.
Yes, exactly. And this is the thing. Like, Xerxes thinks he's untouchable and godlike. But do you think a man who didn't think he was untouchable would have killed an ambassador? Would blaspheme against the gods, would call the priests old and decrepit to their faces? Like, would hold the priests and the gods in contempt? Leonidas has as much, if not more, hubris than Xerxes. Because Xerxes thinks he's a god. Leonidas thinks he's better than a god. Leonidas holds gods in contempt.
And once again, that's the difference between, Snyder's depiction and Miller's depiction is because Snyder's depiction comes from the narrator. Miller's depiction has Leonidas saying it.
Very much so. And that's deliberate, I think, because when Leonidas says it undercuts his behavior and it highlights it. And there's this concept in Greek of hamartia. Occasionally this is translated as sin, but what it really is the fatal flaw that leads to the downfall of a tragic hero or heroine. So you would not be incorrect to say that the hamartia of both Xerxes and Leonidas in the story of 300, either the comic or the film, is hubris. And it brings them both down in the end. And that's it's a concept that predates Christianity, but Christianity likes to translate that word as original sin sometimes, which again is authentic to the concept, but isn't a proper translation. Fatal flaw is a better translation, especially when you're talking in concepts of media. And then what's interesting is we find out Xerxes' fatal flaw, which the man travels on a gold carriage carried by like 100 slaves and has so much gold coming off him, like he's run out of holes, he's had to make new ones. It's like the hubris is implied.
Like he can teach like a full-on college course in opulence.
Yeah, like he sent his ambassador to announce him as a god and demand submission without ever showing his face. It's like the audacity, the sheer audacity. And that's when we talk about hubris, I prefer to translate hubris as audacity rather than pride, because audacity implies not just the pride and the arrogance, but a level of it implies that fatal flaw a little bit more. It implies that this is not just, you're not just proud, you're not just vain, You are so proud and so vain, it's going to bring you down, and other people can see it. It's the audacity. You know, it's Karens who call the police on families having a barbecue. It's that level of, and sometimes it's race-based, as in the example I just gave, sometimes it's not. But there's a level of audacity there that you can only get when it's built on a foundation of sheer bloody-minded arrogance.
Yeah.
And that's where the hubris is. And then we immediately in the story cut to a new splash page for victory. Do you hear that? That's the irony.
Yeah.
I do enjoy how that is put on as Leonidas realizes Xerxes' failure.
Without seeing his own.
We are then immediately given the title of victory, knowing full well that this is going to end in a massacre.
Yeah.
And it's that undercutting of what a victory is. I said right at the start of the stream, it's the Dulce Decorum Est syndrome. For the Spartans, the victory is in dying, not in winning.
Yeah.
Sparta is a death cult. Don't at me. It's very, very obvious. You have father and son fighting in the same phalanx, which makes no sense considering that right at the start he deliberately asked for men with sons.
Yeah.
So why would the son be there? Because he doesn't have a son, but he has brothers who can carry on the line, which is good enough. But that's also indicative of the man's willingness to sacrifice for his king's cause. He's willing to give up his son.
Yeah.
Which feeds right back into the eugenicism that underpins Spartan society.
Yeah.
Like, if my son's not good enough to fight, then he's not good enough, full stop. I'm willing to let my son die because that's all he's good for anyway.
Yeah.
It's dark, it's gross, it's icky, I don't like it, I'm a civilian, sue me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And just as an amusing aside, being blood drunk is the superpowered power-up in the 300 video game. Like, when you kill enough of the enemy, your power bar goes up, and when it goes up to a certain point, you can press a button and you're blood drunk, and it's like a barbarian in D&D raging for a bit. Like, your hits are harder and you're faster and you don't take as much damage if you do get hit. Yeah. And it's like, that's, you know. And then what it does is sometimes when you're blood drunk, it captures the gameplay and then plays it back to you in slow motion, which I think completely just misses the point of what blood drunk means in this. You know, and again, I can see Maggie in the cat saying killing women, children, and old people is always forbidden. Yes, it is. And yet we are supposed to be on the side of the culture that routinely does all three.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. But that's what we're fed. But all that said, there is one thing I want to point out here. This is by far the best "'tis but a scratch" joke since the original.
Yes.
In this piece of media.
Yeah.
He loses an iron battle, and the king says to him, "Dilios, I trust that scratch hasn't made you useless." And the response is, "Hardly, my lord, it's just an eye. The gods saw fit to grace me with a spare." I cackled out loud reading that, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. it's just brilliant. It's a great joke, and it's sorely needed at this point in the text, especially in the comic, because it's getting really heavy and the satire's getting very dark. And then obviously it's followed by the famous "We dine in hell" comment. I understand why they said hell. It's authentic for the audience. If you say in 1997 to an American audience, "We dine in Hades," they're going to look at you and go, "What the fuck?"
Yeah.
If you say "We dine in hell," it has all the connotations you want, and it sounds awesome to your audience.
Yeah.
And then it does immediately undercut itself with the actual what goes on, which feeds into the satire. Miller's very good at that. He does that a few times when he uses terms like blasphemy, when he uses Christianized terms in an ancient Greek context that makes sense. And he does it in a very good way. That's why I've not commented on it, because well done, excellent, no notes. Moving on. And then right at the end, we go back to our cyclical storytelling. And we're back to the wolf, and we have in the waters of Salamis, the Athenian seafaring master who led the united Greek navy to shatter the Persian Empire. Which is accurate. I don't think that's said in the film, is it? Did I miss it in the film?
No, it's not.
No, because it completely undercuts the role of the Spartans. Because the Spartans were, frankly, and tea folks, get your tea ready, were, and I say this as a historian, broadly, that so-called sacrifice of the 300s, it was about as strategically useful as a chocolate teapot. It did very little. It had very little impact. It wasn't interesting. It had very little by way of broad. The only reason it actually carried on as a story is because it was the Spartans and because of the propaganda machine. They bought the Athenians a little bit of time, but the Battle of Salamis was the following year. Like, how much time do you think they really bought?
Yeah.
Like the whole of 300 is based over a week. The actual battle was 3 days.
Yeah.
At best, they bought Athens 3 days. Now, in ancient warfare, that is not enough time. That's not enough time to make a dent in it. It takes longer than that to get your army to all stand in a line together.
Yeah.
It's, without megaphones, you've got to play telephone and pass the message along. And it's interesting because this is where we see the difference between Miller and Snyder. Miller wants to undercut that narrative of the Spartan sacrifice, fascism is good, all of that, glory to Sparta and everything else.
Yeah.
He undercuts that by basically saying, actually, the Athenians beat them at Salamis the year later. Snyder, by not saying that, feeds the glorification of that fascist regime.
Yeah.
Did a motorbike just go past where you are?
I think so.
I heard that. That was loud. But yeah.
Now, so you know what? I'm almost tempted to instead make my video about how Miller and Snyder treat Ephialtes, because we're nearly 3 hours in, and we
can have that discussion now, because the way they treat Ephialtes is interesting. Again, one of the links I shared is a deconstruction of the ableism in this plot, which is very much based around Ephialtes. And is much more obvious in the film than in the comic, but it is there in the comic as well. But the thing is, in the comic, we are seeing this story through the prism of Spartan propaganda. And anything that's not perfect, anything that's not 6 foot tall, ripped, strong, militaristic, is bad. And therefore physical disability is bad in the Spartan mindset.
I disagree slightly. In the graphic novel, that like there's a reason why interspersed amongst the tale until he actually shows up to Leonidas, there it's showing him running to the battlefield, and it's showing things, it cuts to his point of view. Ephialtes in the graphic novel is set up to be a tragic figure, and undercut the Spartan fascist ideal.
Yeah, no, within it, like he is the polar opposite of the Spartan fascist ideal, but he's also the victim of it, very much so the victim of it.
Yeah.
And therefore, while we can't justify his actions as a traitor, we can almost understand them.
Yeah.
It's like with Ephialtes, it's like it's as with any, it's like you have to understand as well. Ephialtes as a figure, as a historical figure, became culturally understood akin to Judas. Like he was the ultimate traitor in Greek history. And so I can see why Miller's going with it, and I can see him saying, look, this person is a victim of the eugenics movement, and what can you possibly expect of someone? They betrayed him long before he betrayed them, is the message Miller's presenting.
Yeah, and eventually the cognitive dissonance of, having drunk the Spartan Kool-Aid and somehow survived what should have been a fall to its death leads him to snap and then betray the Spartans.
Yeah, and it's the idea that even the most disabled Spartan can still survive that fall, still has a good thrust. He might not be that, but he's still a better fighter than most of Xerxes' people. Like that undercurrent is there, more so in the film than in the comic.
Yeah.
But it is there. And the thing with him as well, there's the line Leonidas delivers where he looks at him and he says, and may you live forever.
Yeah.
Now, this is not a line that's attested in any ancient source that I can find, but it is absolutely authentic to the mentality of the Spartans, and I absolutely hat tip to Miller for putting it in there. Because that line, we have been fed an hour and a half in the movie, multiple chapters in the comic, of the idea of a beautiful death, an honourable death. The only glory in Sparta is to die in battle. Like, it is shameful to do anything but die in battle for Sparta. Spartan men don't die at home in their beds. They die in glory and blood on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And that's where the glory is. That's where the honour is. So when Leonidas looks at him and says, I hope you live forever, if you don't understand that culture and you've not heard that, that sounds like a blessing. That sounds like you're saying, I wish you well. That almost sounds like forgiveness. And that's certainly, I think, how Xerxes is supposed to be viewed as receiving it.
Yeah.
Or as overhearing it. But you see the way he bows his head and those words break him. Because what those words are is a curse. You will never die for Sparta. You will never be a Spartan man. Your king has decreed that forever you will be without honor. That's what that line means.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely accurate to what Miller was getting at. And it really drives the point that Miller's making home, in that Sparta is a fascist death cult. Sparta wants its children to not value their lives. And it's very it's very reminiscent of Plato's Republic.
Yeah, and also in the discussion of the Spartan eugenics program in the movie, it's set up as a, you know, preamble to see how badass Leonidas was even as a kid. But in the graphic novel, that discussion is held in the narration as we're meeting Ephialtes.
Yes. So we're not given that background.
Yeah.
Or we're given that background in an almost dismissive way that doesn't encourage us to sit with it and interrogate it. Whereas Miller very much gives us the opportunity very early on to look at this society and say, they do what with their babies? They make their 7-year-olds do what? They make their 18-year-olds do what? And we're given that opportunity multiple times to see how this society is fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
Is fundamentally fascist. Whereas Snyder, I'm going to say he robs his audience of that opportunity to sit with that. And that's especially because Snyder goes out of his way to conflate Sparta with America.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be very careful how I finish this sentence. That's something worth sitting with as a member of Snyder's audience, as to the fact that he does that, and it's worth sitting with wondering why he does that in the context of Sparta as America, Sparta as Marines.
And
why doesn't he want you to sit with the idea of eugenics in Spartan society?
And in the graphic novel, Ephialtes is shown as racing towards the battlefield, and we're introduced to him through his point of view.
Oh yeah, he's very keen.
And we basically learn that he has drank the Spartan Kool-Aid.
Oh yeah, very much so. And it's, look, again, from the outside looking into America, your culture's weird. Yeah. And I say this as someone who married into it, so I knew it. I had my eyes open, folks. I knew it was weird, but this thing of, you know what it is with Ephialtes? He's drunk the Kool-Aid and he'll bleed to keep the stripes red.
Yeah.
And we said this last week about another character. That mentality of it's nationalism versus patriotism. Ephialtes is nationalistic, but there's no substance to it.
Yeah.
He's perfectly happy to betray the first chance he gets. He's being betrayed. He doesn't fully grasp what being a soldier means, and he thinks he can do it. He's the ancient Greek answer to those kids who play Call of Duty and then think they know what war looks like.
Yeah.
And that's a criticism of that jingoistic, nationalistic mentality that doesn't grasp that actually real patriotism is caring about your soldiers on the front line, is standing up for what you believe in, is that, but it's very difficult to present real nationalism in Leonidas, because the minute you turn nationalism to patriotism and you put it in Leonidas's mouth, you glorify fascism, because that's what he's patriotic for. And that's why it's a satire, because it walks that line between what patriotism should be and what it is in the context of being part of a fascist system.
Meanwhile, in 300, we're introduced to Ephialtes as a skulking figure in the background, sneaking behind the army.
Yes, he's a traitor from the off. And that's very, very telling. And it's this idea of, again, I have to be careful how I word this. Look, America has a, shall we say, checkered history with its undesirables, with what it deems undesirable, be that disability, race, creed, whatever you want to call it. And so you see the difference in someone willing to reckon with that history. You have to understand, Miller is raised Catholic Irish. Miller's probably old enough to remember when places in America had signs on the door that said, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. He knows what it's like to be an outsider in his own country, to be considered lesser. Maybe not to the same extent, but he knows that. Whereas I think Snyder, whether he knows that or not, it doesn't come across on screen, and he goes out of his way to it's victim blaming. It's victim blaming. He takes this character who has been forgotten, left behind, would have been murdered by his own country for daring to exist. And if you're hearing echoes of the BLM movement, you're probably supposed to be in what I'm saying here. And he blames that character for their own isolation and then makes them a traitor. And it's like, okay, but what did Sparta do for him? What did Sparta do for him? The character is presented very much as a child with the mind of a child and the ideologies and the mentalities of a child, in that if you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. And that in itself is ableist when you're talking about disabled characters. But the way Miller does it is Miller asks the question of, but so why does he owe Sparta his loyalty? And he's asking America the question, what has your country done to earn your loyalty? He's basically taking Kennedy's quote of, ask not what your country can do for you, and turning it on its head and saying, fuck you, actually, what has my country done for me?
Yeah.
Whereas Snyder's looking at it and going, he's just drinking that Kool-Aid and he's just going, you must be obedient and loyal to your country at all costs, no matter what it does to you, even if you only survive by sheer dumb luck and actually it wants to murder you and everyone like you.
Yeah.
Which one makes more sense? I know which one makes more sense to me, but you all know what my politics are, so that's no surprise. But clearly, this film resonated with enough people. I mean, am I saying that this film was solely responsible for Donald Trump? Absolutely not. Nowhere near. It probably doesn't even break the top 20. But am I saying that this film, in the way Snyder made it, is as much a symptom of the mentalities that would eventually give rise to the presidency of Donald Trump and everything else that ensued? Yeah. Like there's an argument there.
Well, let me put it this way. I'm very glad that I only just recently watched 300 and I didn't see it when it came out.
Please elaborate. I think it's worth you elaborating on that comment.
Because, now, obviously, media reading your media critically and advocating for that has essentially been the mission statement of the channel almost from day one.
Mm-hmm.
When 300 came out, I was still very funny.
Mm-hmm.
I was still very uncritical in my reception of media. Like, for example, so 300 came out in 2006, the movie.
I don't even think we'd met in 2006, had we? No.
No. So, yeah, 300, the movie came out in 2006. 3 years later, two to 3 years later, during my senior year, 08 to
Are you
09.
about to tell the Obama story?
No.
Okay.
We had a, break into small groups and pick a book to read for this segment of English literature. Something that was done for the senior year.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the ones that I had already read, I'd already read through. So it was between One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, yeah, I know where this is going. Carry on.
Yeah. By the time I got up to sign up for it, the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest group had already filled out. So I picked The Handmaid's Tale. And the first time I read The Handmaid's Tale, I fucking hated that book because it got the Bible wrong.
I mean, there's a lot of reasons to hate that book, but getting the Bible wrong is very low on the list.
Yeah. And, I basically, I hated it because it demonized religion and twisted the Bible, in my opinion. I wasn't developed enough in media critique to where I could see that the book was showing a society that used the Bible to, and Christian nationalism to achieve its own inhumane ends.
Can I ask you a question about that? Did you have the version of the book that had the author's note at the end of it, explaining where all the ideas came from?
I think I might have, but it was, over a decade ago, so I can't say for sure.
Because I remember reading that book, and there's a bit at the end where there's a few pages where she goes into how every single thing done to the women in the book there's like historical precedent for it.
Yeah.
And that's very telling. Also, folks, if you want to write a horror story, just take things that are actually done to people of color and do them to white people. You know, because that's basically like, if you want to write a political story like that, that's how you go about doing that.
Or B. Jordan Peterson.
I mean, that man's existence is a horror story, but let's not get into that.
I'm not talking about Lobster Man. I'm talking about the director Jordan Peterson, who did Get Out, Nope, Candyman. Basically the biggest black voice in cinema as we speak, as Ryan Coogler accepted.
But yeah, so the reason I think, anyway, I'm going to let you finish telling your story. But yeah, that book is based, as an aside, is based entirely on historical instances of things that were done to women at some point or another throughout history.
So my point is, if I had watched 300 when it came out while I was still in my uncritical fundy state of mind, I probably would have swallowed the propaganda hook, line, and sinker.
Mm-hmm. And this is the danger with screen versus text. And by text, I am including graphic novels in that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are primed as a society when we view cinema media, screen media, to just sit back with some popcorn and accept it. Like, that's a thing we do. We don't critically analyze it. We don't tear it apart in the same way we do reading. And that's largely because actually different parts of our brains are being used when we watch films as compared to reading. And again, even with audiobooks, like similar parts of your brain to reading, but sometimes it is very easy to just forget to be critical when listening to an audiobook. Although I absolutely do support anyone who listens to audiobooks because, accessibility matters. But you have to do it critically. You can't just sit and listen to it like it's a radio. You have to sit down with a notebook and pen, take notes, read about it, Google shit, in the same way you would if you were reading critically. And you will have to absorb it in that way. It's more effort. And we don't put that kind of effort into films. And that's why Media Musings, we do a lot of films. Because it's easy for the audience to see, so you know what the hell we're talking about. If we asked you to read a book every week, I think we'd have a smaller audience than we do.
Also, it's easier to prep for.
Yeah, it's much easier to prep for. But it is worth having the discussion, because what this text does, 300, is mythologize a very real historical moment. And it mythologizes it in such a way, like, this is why we eventually nixed comparing it to Troy, because Troy is the telling of a mythical war zone. But this story, this piece of propaganda, which, let's not make any bones about it, every aspect, every telling we have of this battle is propaganda all the way down. Like, it's not even pretending it's not propaganda, it's deliberate. It's like when the traitor was eventually killed in Greek history. If you read the Herodotus, it's in there. He was killed several years later. And even though it wasn't for anything to do with the battle, the Spartans still paid out the reward for his killing, because they held him in such contempt, because he was the traitor. And it's a very, very... it's a propaganda piece, first and foremost, is this story. Every society has its band of, it's gunfight at the OK Corral, it's Iwo Jima, it's
The Alamo.
Last Man Standing, the Alamo, it's Into the Valley of the Death, Road the 5000. It's every society has its stories of brave last stands, and that's why this film was made. It's why this comic was made, not because it was telling a historical story from ancient Greece, because most people don't give a shit about ancient Greece. Present company, except
Yes.
But what people do care about is deeper truths. People care about bravery, heroism, honor, duty, loyalty, patriotism, nationalism. This is, like, I said this during the primer, What does a modern audience have in common with the original audience? Now, the original audience for 300 are not the people in 1997 who bought the comic, and not the people in 2006 who went to the cinema. They're the Greeks who heard the story of the 300. They're the original audience. Now, what do we as a society, what did we have in common with them? Think about what we had in common. We had a mentality that told us that we were under attack by the hordes of othered people from the Middle East who were coming to take over and were going to wipe us out and enslave us and make us follow their religion. And we didn't want that. And we thought we were free relative to them. Now, you can take those statements I've just made and you can put those in the mouths of an ancient Greek, and they're still true, because that's what we had in common as an audience. We were primed and ready for this propaganda because our circumstances were so similar.
And, well, I mean, in fact, the whole conception of the East versus the West
is very much bound up in stories of this particular battle.
Yeah, it all goes back to the Greco-Persian Wars.
And when you take that and then you take the Hellenic world supposedly being the birthplace of democracy and civilization, when you take a culture that's the opposite of that, you automatically issue, if you've been told Greece is democracy and civilization and, you know, the shining city on a hill, then anything that's the opposite that is barbaric, is evil, is fascist, is wrong, is, you know, there's something wrong with it because it's not civil. And that's propaganda. That is pure propaganda all the way down.
Yeah.
It's like we wouldn't know a lot of ancient Greek history if it wasn't for the Persians. Like, they're the ones who wrote it down. They're the ones who translated it from the Greek to Arabic, and then when it got translated back in the Middle Ages. Or, you know, similar languages in that sort of school. And they're the ones who learned the lessons of ancient Greek thought. They're the ones who were interested in ancient Greek philosophy and history and mathematics. And so they preserved those cultures in writing. And there's a lot we wouldn't know if it wasn't for the Persians and other cultures in the Middle East. And that, I think, is a really important thing to remember. That, and I said it halfway through the stream and I'll say it again. Yes, in the end, the Hellenic world won that war. And then promptly tore itself apart with the Delian League 2 years later.
Yeah.
Because first of all, when you win once. You don't win forever. And second, history is not written by the winners. It's written by the people who write shit down. And this is why we have the thing is, this comic at the end gives you a reading list. And Ring sent me this reading list and I nicked 3 of them straight away. And it's only a 4-list reading list.
Yeah.
And I went and found other links, and that's why they're all in the description for you to read. Because we have, for all these thousands of years, had a very, very blinkered view of that battle. We have one account of it, which is Herodotus, who is telling the Greek point of view. We have Plutarch, who is telling the Greek point of view. We don't have, or we didn't have, Persian sources for that battle. Now, I don't care who you are. I don't care what culture you're from. If you're in a war, okay, like, do you really think, just stop and think for a moment, in 50 years' time, when they're writing the histories, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how many of those histories do you think, from the Ukrainian point of view, are going to point out that Russian civilians were being arrested in their thousands for protesting against it? How many do you think are going to point out how many Russians tried to get out of Russia immediately? Or how Putin was, at one point, there were genuine concerns that there was going to be a full-on revolution in Russia, and that like the Western powers were pushing for that? How many do you think are going to remember or mention that a lot of the Russian soldiers are conscripts? How many do you think are going to mention Ukrainian war crimes? And yes, there have been Ukrainian war crimes because they've been on fucking Twitter. And I'm not saying Russia hasn't had war crimes, but there will be a very one-sided view of the war. And that's why, again, it's so important to interrogate your sources and look at sources from both sides. Even if you don't like the sources, even if you are fundamentally opposed to what they stood for, it is important to look at sources from all points of view in order to get to the truth. Like, do you think we really would know, for example, just as an example, do you think we would know the real figures for deaths in concentration camps if we didn't look at German sources? We wouldn't have a clue. Because the Germans were the ones who kept the records of who they murdered. Like, you know, we couldn't just put that together by how many shoes and gold teeth are left behind. Because we get radically different figures. Don't get me wrong, that those bits of information inform what we have, but without the German records, we wouldn't know. And that goes for any war. When they're writing the histories of Iraq and Afghanistan, I wouldn't trust any history that didn't talk to translators in those countries who worked with the US Army, but also didn't talk to the locals in those countries. If you read books on the disputed West Bank, if you don't read points of view from both sides, you're going to develop a point of view and not know why that's your point of view, because you're not going to know the opposite point of view. And there is no war, there is no political idea that is so heinous that you should not familiarize yourself with it. Like, I'm a great believer in that. It's like, I am absolutely anti-censorship, and I'm anti-censorship because I would rather the fascists stood up at a lectern and said what they think than whisper and insinuate and hide. Because when they're stood there and they're saying it out loud, when they're releasing films like 300, we can debunk that. We can spend 3 hours on YouTube talking about it. We can't do that if that film's never made, if we silence that voice. We can't do that if we don't go looking for the points of view we don't like. So always go looking for the points of view you don't like. Always check your biases. And that's how, like, I would not have realized Miller's text was a satire if I didn't have that background of 300, the movie.
Yeah.
Because it's only when you see it presented uncritically that you realize there's more to the original text. And that's really important. So always just broaden your horizons. Don't take anything for granted, no matter how obvious it seems. Always find out. And the thing is, if you don't know the enemy's argument, if you don't know why the Spartans thought it was okay to murder their babies if they looked a bit dodgy, how the hell are you ever going to argue against that? You have to know what you're arguing against to be able to argue against it. And Miller does a fantastic job in this of giving you just enough that you question. And I think that's where I want to wrap up.
Yeah.
Because that's your tagline, Ring.
Yeah.
That's what Miller's done.
Basically, TLDR. Would it be fair to say that Miller is good reception, Snyder is bad reception?
I think it's more nuanced than that. I think Miller is an attempt at very good reception, and Snyder is an attempt at aping that without grasping the nuances of it.
Yeah.
But the thing with reception is you can't judge something as good or bad reception, because good or bad reception depends on the audience. If the audience receives it in the way it was intended, it's good.
Yeah.
If it's authentic, it's good. Like, both of these texts are very authentic to the Spartan mentality. And in that sense, they're both good reception.
Yeah.
Because Snyder is presenting to you exactly how the Spartans' minds worked. And he's doing it uncritically, and you're invited along for the ride. Miller is presenting to you exactly how Spartan minds work, but he's poking fun at it, and he's poking not fun, but poking holes in it. He's satirizing it. So in that sense, they're both good reception. But I wouldn't present either of these to an audience and ask them to engage uncritically. Neither, like, these both come across as very popcorn, kick back and relax pieces of media. If I met someone who had done that, I would be very concerned about the messages they took from it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're good because they give you an authentic view, but they're not good because they require effort from you for you to get to the point they're making. But it depends on whether you think requiring effort from the audience is a positive or negative. I think it's a positive, and so therefore I think both of them are, in their own way, good reception, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are. It doesn't mean the messaging doesn't have to be good for it to be good reception.
Yeah.
Like, something could be good reception and be morally reprehensible if what it's presenting is also morally reprehensible.
Yeah. And so just Scummer, I hope you understand why we pretty heartily disagree with this statement you put at the beginning of the chat.
Maybe it should be FFS instead of 3Fs. Maybe it should be Fapping to Fascism by Snyder.
Yeah.
You know, it is what it is. But that's what's so good about Media Musings. We can disagree. We can have these conversations. I think Miller definitely does deserve a second look, and he did enough that I am comfortable recommending this text on the understanding that whoever takes the recommendation reads it critically and understands that it is first and foremost a satire, and it's a satire of propaganda, which means if you're not careful, you're going to read it as straight propaganda, and you shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah. Also, once again, I'm going to point out that we've still accidentally kept to the unbroken, the unspoken rule of Media Musings, where we first delve into a genre / medium by discussing a satire.
Honestly, we really should have just called this Classical Satires Month.
Yeah. But
like, last month was a satire of the Christianization of polytheism. This week is a satire of propaganda and warfare, and next week's a satire of ancient comedy. Speaking of next week,
yeah, So next week we're discussing Chirac, which is Spike Lee's adaptation of Lysistrata.
I will say it's a fantastic movie. Definitely watch it, but strong trigger warning. It is very relevant to the African American experience in the United States. And it is also incredibly harrowing in parts. If you are triggered by the death of children, gang warfare, race relations, be careful. I won't say give it a miss because I think it is worth watching, but be very, very careful and make sure you're in the right frame of mind. If you have religious trauma, this film is permeated by Christian imagery and Christian and a Christian mentality. Like one of the main characters is a Christian pastor. Again, be careful. Your health comes first, your mental health comes first before watching any movie. But I do think, as with films like Schindler's List, the Magdalena Sisters, this Chirac is, it's a film that will change you if you've never seen it. And it's well worth, change hurts, but it's worth it. But yes, trigger warning on it.
Yeah. And so next Sunday, that'll be our episode of Meaty Musings, and then we are going to kick off March with a discussion of the Sandman, the Netflix adaptation of the Neil Gaiman graphic novel series by the same name.
So you've got time to binge it, folks.
Yep. And we will follow that with Superman versus the Elite, which is an adaptation of a Superman arc entitled "What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way," and is arguably a an answer to the uncritical aping of comic book satire that kind of permeated the late 90s and early 2000s.
Grimdark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or basically why comics shouldn't all just be grimdark.
Because anyone who read comics would unalive themselves. Like Grimdark, there's a reason it's called Grimdark. It's like reading to unalive yourself to.
Or specifically why Superman isn't the character to make grimdark. Zach Snyder. And edited video wise, coming either Wednesday or Friday, depending on when I have time to, film, or time/spoons to film. I'm going to be doing a deconstruction of the This Is Sparta scene to go into even further depth the difference between Miller's satirical presentation and Zach Snyder's Aderzo line presentation.
Mm-hmm. And I will have absolutely no involvement in that whatsoever, other than Ring telling me it's happening. And I'll probably be there in the chat when it premieres, if I'm free. So yeah, for Ring's unfiltered view on that, I'm looking forward to hearing it because I want to hear the American point of view on that particular scene.
Yeah.
And I think it's an excellent little aside to this. So do come along to that. Should be fun.
And I do have a Twitter and community tab poll up for my topic for the week after that. But Florida did a thing, so now I have to cover that. So I'll go over. I'll make so the voted on topic is being pushed forward a week or back a week, however you view it. But so this week, Snyder versus Miller. Next week, Florida is looking at promoting a Christian alternative test to the SAT versus SAT/ACT. It's called the Classic Learning Test.
Ask me next week how I feel about that. I need to give my brain time to. I didn't know about that, and I need to give my time to process that and its implications before I form an opinion.
Yeah.
Ask me next week how I feel about
it. But yeah, it's being promoted as a classical and Christian alternative to the SAT.
Okay, they do understand that the SAT tests more than your ability to recite biblical passages, right?
Yeah. But as someone who spent most of my schooling in a private Christian school, I have thoughts.
Yes, I'm sure you do. And I'm sure if you give me a few more minutes, I might have some as well. So you better cut off before I drag this out for another half hour.
Yeah. So, so this week, Snyder versus Miller. Next week, Florida is doing a thing. Week after that, whatever the hell the poll decides.
Damn it, Florida.
With that, we'll move to taglines.
Take care, be good. And if you can't be good, remember, use your noodle.
Hold on. And remember, the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think on. Too often, we forget that.